Sometimes the people who've sacrificed the most are the ones with the most to give. On Christmas Eve, a father working as a baggage handler watches families missing their holiday dinners because a plane won't start. The mechanics give up. The CEO panics. But Noah Calderon remembers fixing fighter jets before he gave up everything for his son. When he shouts, "I can fix that plane," across the airport, most people laugh. Security rushes over. But the airline's CEO sees something special in his eyes. She takes a chance on him. He fixes the plane in minutes. Then she offers him a job that could save the airline and destroy his custody case. But what happens when they discover someone is sabotaging the planes on purpose? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning cold bit through Noah Calderon's worn orange safety vest as he guided another Boeing 737 toward Gate B-12 at Denver International Airport. His breath formed small clouds in the December air, dissipating quickly in the controlled chaos of the airport's operations. At 38, Noah had the weathered hands of a man who'd spent years working with machinery, but his eyes held a sharpness that spoke of deeper knowledge he'd carefully buried beneath years of routine. In his breast pocket, wrapped in faded leather, sat a challenge coin from his days with the 355th Aircraft Maintenance Squadron. Most days, he forgot it was there. Today, as families hurried past him toward their Christmas destinations, the coin felt heavier than usual. "Dad, you're doing that thing again." 10-year-old Mateo Calderon sat in the employee break room, homework spread across a plastic table that had seen better decades. His dark hair fell into eyes that mirrored his father's intelligence, though without the weight of compromise that shadowed Noah's gaze. "What thing?" Noah asked, pulling off his safety gloves and settling into the chair across from his son. The break room smelled of burnt coffee and the industrial disinfectant that seemed to permeate every corner of the airport. You get this look when you watch the planes, like you're thinking about something far away. Mateo closed his math workbook and studied his father with the unsettling perception that only children possess. Mum used to say the same thing. Noah's chest tightened at the mention of Elena. 3 years since their divorce, and her absence still felt like a missing piece in conversations with their son. "Just making sure everything runs smooth, me Joe. That's my job." But Mateo was right, and they both knew it. When Noah watched the aircraft taxi and depart, part of him was calculating thrust-to-weight ratios, analyzing the subtle sounds of turbofan engines, and mentally troubleshooting systems most people never thought about. It was a habit he couldn't shake, even though he'd walked away from that world 12 years ago. The framed photograph on his small locker told the story he rarely shared. Lieutenant Colonel Miguel Calderon stood beside a young Noah in front of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, both wearing flight suits and the easy smiles of men who understood the machines that defied gravity. Miguel had been a test pilot, one of the best, until a system failure during a routine training flight took him away when Noah was 16. "Your grandfather would have liked this place," Noah said, nodding toward the window where a United flight was pushing back from the gate. All these different aircraft, all the complex systems working together. He always said airports were like symphonies, thousands of moving parts creating something beautiful. Mateo followed his father's gaze. "Will you tell me about him again? About how he taught you about planes?" Noah's throat constricted. Miguel Calderon had been more than a father. He'd been Noah's first and greatest teacher. Every weekend, they'd spend hours in the garage, taking apart radios and small engines, with Miguel explaining how electrical systems worked, how mechanical components interacted, how to diagnose problems by sound and feel rather than just by manuals. He had this way of seeing machines, Noah said, his voice soft with memory. Not just as collections of parts, but as living systems. He'd listen to an engine and hear stories where it had been stressed, what components were wearing out, what needed attention before it became a problem. Like you do with the baggage conveyors. Noah smiled. It was true. Just last week, he'd heard a subtle change in the motor housing of Carousel 3 and had quietly notified maintenance before it seized up completely. The other handlers had called it lucky, guessing, but Noah knew better. Some instincts never fade, no matter how deeply you try to bury them. "Dad, why did you stop fixing airplanes?" The question hung in the recycled air between them. Noah had answered it a dozen different ways over the years, but never with complete honesty. The truth was more complicated than a 10-year-old should have to understand. When Elena had gotten pregnant with Mateo, Noah had been 3 years into his aerospace engineering program at Colorado State University, working part-time as an Air Force contractor. The pregnancy wasn't planned, but it wasn't unwanted, until Elena's complications required bed rest for the final 4 months. Someone had to work full-time to keep their small apartment and pay for medical bills that insurance didn't cover. Someone had to be present, reliable, immediately available. The choice had seemed temporary then. Finish the degree later, get back into aerospace when things stabilized. But life had other plans. Elena's postpartum depression, Mateo's early childhood asthma that required constant vigilance, the slow erosion of a marriage under the weight of financial stress and delayed dreams. By the time the divorce papers were signed, Noah had been handling baggage for 8 years. It was steady work, union protected, with benefits and a schedule that allowed him to be present for Mateo's school events, doctor appointments, and the 1,000 small moments that make up a childhood. He'd become very good at convincing himself it was enough. "Sometimes life asks you to choose between what you want and what matters most," Noah said finally. "You were what mattered most." Mateo absorbed this with the serious expression he wore when processing adult complexities. "But you still remember how to fix planes, right?" "I remember some things." "Then why don't you fix planes here, at the airport?" Noah glanced around the break room, noting the faded safety posters and the schedule board where his name appeared under baggage handling evening shift. How could he explain that walking away from your expertise felt different than walking away from a job? That every day he saw problems he could solve, systems he could improve, inefficiencies he could address, but that speaking up would only highlight how far he'd fallen from where he'd started. "It's complicated, my Joe. Different kinds of work require different kinds of training, different certifications, and I'm good at what I do now." It wasn't entirely a lie. Noah was exceptionally good at baggage handling. He knew every piece of equipment, every safety protocol, every shortcut that saved time without compromising security. His supervisors valued his reliability, his willingness to work holidays, his calm competence during the chaos of flight delays and weather emergencies. But being good at something wasn't the same as being called to it. The break room door opened, and Dave Martinez, Noah's supervisor, stuck his head inside. "Calderon, we've got a situation at Gate C-15. Mechanical delay on the 6:30 to Phoenix. They're asking for extra hands to help passengers with connections." Noah checked his watch for 4:47 p.m. Nearly 3 hours left in his shift. "On my way." He turned to Mateo. "Finish your homework. Mrs. Chen will keep an eye on you until I'm done." Mrs. Chen, the kind elderly woman who managed the employee childcare area, had become a surrogate grandmother to Mateo over the years. She asked no questions about why a 10-year-old spent most evenings at the airport, accepting Noah's explanation that family helped family, and sometimes family was whatever worked. As Noah walked through the terminal toward Gate C-15, he found himself studying the faces of delayed passengers with the empathy of someone who understood disappointment. A young mother bounced a crying toddler while checking her phone repeatedly. An elderly man in a military dress uniform sat straight-backed in his chair, staring at the departure board with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait. 3 college-aged kids shared a bag of chips and tried to make light of missing Christmas Eve dinner with their families. These were the people who mattered, Noah reminded himself, not the complex technical problems he sometimes glimpsed through open cockpit doors or maintenance bay windows. Not the sophisticated diagnostic challenges that made his fingers itch to dive into wiring harnesses and computer modules. The people, the families trying to get home, the reliable service that kept the world connected. At Gate C-15, the scene was controlled chaos. The gate agent, a young woman whose nameplate read Jennifer, was fielding questions from frustrated passengers while coordinators worked their phones to arrange alternative flights. Through the window, Noah could see the aircraft, a regional CRJ-900, with its engine cowlings open and two mechanics shaking their heads over something in the avionics bay. "What's the story?" Noah asked Dave as they approached the gate podium. "Avionics problem. Something with the flight management computer. Mechanics say it might be a software issue, might be hardware. Could be 30 minutes, could be 3 hours." Dave shrugged with the resignation of someone who'd seen it all before. "They want us to help manage the passenger flow, maybe set up some rebooking stations." Noah nodded, but his attention had drifted to the technical conversation happening at the aircraft. One of the mechanics was holding a diagnostic tablet, gesturing at readouts that Noah couldn't see from this distance but could imagine. The other was on a radio, probably conferring with maintenance control about parts availability and repair timelines. "I'll start setting up chairs for the rebooking queue," Noah said, but part of his mind was already analyzing the problem. Flight management computers in regional jets were notorious for software conflicts, especially during temperature transitions. The fix was usually straightforward if you understood the boot sequence and knew which modules to restart in which order. As he arranged chairs and helped passengers understand their options, Noah found himself listening to fragments of the technical discussion. Words like initialization failure and corrupted database drifted across the gate area, classic symptoms of a software glitch that would look mysterious to technicians who approached it as a hardware problem. The framed photograph in his locker might as well have been calling his name. Miguel Calderon had taught his son that understanding machines meant understanding their language, just the official diagnostic codes, but the subtle patterns of behavior that revealed the real story. Noah could hear that language now, in the frustration of the mechanics and the specific symptoms they were describing. But it wasn't his place to interfere. He was baggage handling, not aircraft maintenance. He had a son to think about, a custody arrangement that depended on stability and predictability. Speaking up would only create complications he couldn't afford. So Noah arranged chairs and answered passenger questions and tried to ignore the growing certainty that he could solve the problem grounding Flight 1247 in about 10 minutes, if anyone had bothered to ask. 3 hours later, as his shift finally ended and he collected Mateo from the childcare area, the CRJ-900 was still sitting at Gate C-15 with its cowlings open. The passengers had long since been rebooked on other flights or given hotel vouchers for the night. The mechanics had called it a day, planning to return with fresh eyes and possibly a replacement module in the morning. "Did they fix the airplane?" Mateo asked, as they walked through the nearly empty terminal toward the parking garage. "Not yet," Noah replied, fingering the challenge coin in his pocket. "Some problems take time. But you knew how to fix it, didn't you?" Noah stopped walking and looked down at his son, whose perception continued to unsettle him. "What makes you say that?" "You had that look again, the one you get when you're thinking about planes, but sadder." Outside, snow was beginning to fall on the Colorado landscape, dusting the parked aircraft and ground equipment with a thin layer of white. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and somewhere a family wouldn't be together because a computer module needed to be reinitialized in the correct sequence. "Sometimes, mijo," Noah said as they reached their aging Honda Civic, "the hardest part about being able to fix something is knowing when it's not your job to try." But as he drove home through the early snowfall, Noah couldn't shake the image of that grounded aircraft, or the sound of passengers learning their Christmas plans had been disrupted by a problem he understood completely. The challenge coin seemed to weigh more with each passing mile, carrying the accumulated weight of 12 years of roads not taken and expertise left unused. Tomorrow would bring new flights, new passengers, and new problems. And Noah would watch it all from the edges, reliable and competent, and safely invisible, while the machines he understood better than most continued their complex dance just beyond his reach. Christmas Eve morning arrived, with the kind of bitter cold that made aircraft systems temperamental and ground crews miserable. Noah clocked in at 6 a.m. to find Denver International Airport already buzzing with holiday travelers, their faces mixing excitement and anxiety in equal measure. The departure boards showed a sea of green, on-time indicators, but Noah had worked enough holiday shifts to know that wouldn't last. By 10 a.m., his prediction proved accurate. The first mechanical delay appeared on the border Southwest flight to Las Vegas with a hydraulic issue, then a United flight to Chicago with a generator problem. Airport operations moved into the controlled urgency that Noah recognized from years of holiday chaos management. He was loading baggage onto Flight 847 to Seattle when the announcement echoed across Concourse B. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a mechanical issue, Mountain Air Flight 293 to Phoenix has been delayed indefinitely. Passengers should remain in the gate area for further updates. Noah glanced toward Gate B-17, where he could see the familiar sight of frustrated travelers gathering around the gate podium. The aircrafter CRJ-700 regional jetsat motionless at the jetway, its auxiliary power unit running but no other signs of life. "Another Christmas Eve special," muttered Jake Hernandez, Noah's loading partner. "That's the third mechanical this morning. Holiday travel's cursed, man." Noah finished securing the cargo net and walked with Jake toward their next assignment. As they passed Gate B-17, he couldn't help but notice the unusual number of people in maintenance uniforms gathered around the aircraft. Two mechanics stood beside an open avionics bay, while a third held what looked like a diagnostic tablet. Their body language spoke of genuine confusion rather than routine troubleshooting. The gate agent, a harried-looking woman in her 50s, was fielding increasingly aggressive questions from passengers. A businessman in an expensive suit was demanding to know why a simple computer problem was taking so long to fix. A young mother held a crying infant while trying to explain to her 6-year-old why they might miss Christmas dinner with Grandma. "Folks, I understand your frustration," the gate agent was saying into her handheld microphone. "Our maintenance team is working diligently to resolve the issue. As soon as we have more information, I'll make another announcement." Noah slowed his pace, his trained ear picking up fragments of conversation between the mechanics. Words like cascade failure and primary bus drifted across the gate area. He found himself analyzing the symptoms without conscious intention, the way his father had taught him to listen to machines. "You coming, Calderon?" Jake called from 20 feet ahead. "We've got the Nashville flight to load." "Yeah, 1 second." Noah lingered near the gate, ostensibly organizing equipment, but actually observing the maintenance situation. The lead mechanic was shaking his head and closing the diagnostic tablet with the frustrated motion of someone who'd run out of ideas. Through the aircraft's open cabin door, Noah could see into the cockpit where the captain and first officer were running through checklists with the methodical patience of professionals who understood that some problems couldn't be rushed. But their repeated attempts to initialize various systems suggested they were encountering the same failures the ground crew was seeing. A new voice cut through the gate area, noise authoritative, female, with the precise diction of someone accustomed to command. "What's the situation, Tom?" Noah turned to see a woman in her early 40s approaching the lead mechanic. She wore a crisp navy blazer over dark slacks, and her bearing suggested management rather than operations. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her eyes moved constantly, taking in details with the rapid assessment of someone who made decisions under pressure. This had to be Victoria Hale, the airline's new CEO. Noah had read about her appointment in the employee newsletter, the first woman to head Mountain Air, brought in from a larger carrier to modernize operations and improve reliability. According to the article, she was spending Christmas week personally observing operations to understand the challenges facing the airline. "It's complicated, Miss Hale," the mechanic replied, his tone respectful but strained. We've got what looks like a cascade failure in the flight management system. Multiple computers showing fault codes, but the diagnostics aren't making sense. It's like the system is trying to boot up, but can't complete the initialization sequence. Victoria studied the diagnostic tablet the mechanic handed her. Even from a distance, Noah could see her frown deepening as she scrolled through the error codes. How long to get a replacement FMS unit? That's just it, we don't think it's the hardware. All the individual components test good. It's something in the software integration, but we can't isolate it. Could be a corrupted database. Could be a timing issue between modules, this kind of problem. The mechanic spread his hands helplessly. It's above our pay grade. Noah felt his chest tighten. He'd seen this exact failure pattern before, during his contractor days working on military aircraft. The symptoms pointed to a specific type of software conflict that occurred when multiple systems tried to access the same data bus simultaneously during startup. The fix was actually straightforward, a manual reset of the bus priorities, followed by a staged reinitialization of the flight management modules. But he was baggage handling, not aircraft maintenance. Speaking up would create exactly the kind of attention he'd spent 12 years avoiding. Victoria was checking her phone, probably calculating the cascade effects of this delay. How many passengers? 137. About half are connections to smaller cities. If we can't get this flight out today, most of them won't make it home until the day after Christmas. The weight of that information settled over the gate area, like a cloud. Noah looked at the faces around him, the crying infant, the elderly couple holding hands and trying to stay patient, the military servicemen in dress blues who'd probably burned, leave time to get home for the holiday. There has to be something we can do, Victoria said, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who'd built a career on solving problems. What about calling in a specialist from maintenance control? It's Christmas Eve, ma'am. The senior avionics guys are either working other emergencies or they're with their families. We could try to get someone here by tonight. But the mechanic's expression said what he couldn't voice, that tonight would be too late for any meaningful solution. Noah found himself stepping closer to the conversation, drawn by an instinct he thought he'd buried. The diagnostic tablet in Victoria's hands was displaying exactly the error codes he'd expected to see. Bus fault 42, initialization timeout, FMS, database corruption. It was a textbook case of timing conflict, probably triggered by a recent software update that hadn't accounted for the specific hardware configuration of this particular aircraft. Excuse me, the words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. Victoria and the mechanic turned toward him, taking in his orange safety vest and baggage handling credentials. Their expressions shifted from hope to polite dismissal in the space of a heartbeat. "Sir, if you need assistance with rebooking," Victoria began, "I can fix that plane." The words hung in the recycled air of the terminal like a challenge. Noah felt every eye in the gate area turn toward him, passengers, crew members, maintenance personnel. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized there was no taking the statement back. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sorry?" "The flight management system. You've got a bus priority conflict causing a cascade initialization failure. It's not hardware, it's a software timing issue. I can fix it." The lead mechanic's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. "Sir, with all due respect, you're baggage handling. This is complex avionics troubleshooting that requires certification on Honeywell FMS systems, experience with CRJ, 700 electrical architecture, and an understanding of how software modules interact during startup sequences." Noah's voice remained steady, despite the tremor he felt inside. "I have all of that." A murmur rippled through the assembled passengers. Someone in the back called out, "Let him try." Others began to nod and voice agreement. The businessman who'd been complaining earlier stepped forward. "Look, I don't care if he's the janitor. If this guy can get us to Phoenix today, I say we listen to him." Victoria studied Noah with new attention, her executive instincts clearly engaged. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." "What's your background?" Noah felt the challenge coin press against his chest as he drew a deep breath. Air Force Avionics, contractor work on military FMS systems. 3 years of aerospace engineering before. He glanced toward the employee area where Mateo was probably doing homework. Before life got complicated. The terminal seemed to hold its breath. Victoria looked from Noah to the diagnostic tablet, then to the mechanic, who was shaking his head with barely concealed skepticism. Tom, how long would it take to get an outside specialist here? Minimum 6 hours, assuming we can find someone willing to come in on Christmas Eve. Victoria checked her watch, then looked back at Noah. And you think you can fix this how quickly? Give me 15 minutes with the aircraft systems. If I can't isolate the problem in that time, you haven't lost anything but a quarter hour. Miss Hale, the mechanic interrupted, this is highly irregular. Union protocols require that all aircraft maintenance be performed by certified. I'm not touching any hardware, Noah said quickly. This is software troubleshooting, system resets and reinitialization sequences. If I'm wrong about the diagnosis, nothing I do will make the problem worse. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between the stranded passengers and the grounded aircraft. Noah could almost see her calculating risks, the potential embarrassment of trusting a baggage handler against the certainty of disappointing 137 passengers on Christmas Eve. "What do you need?" she asked finally. The mechanic's jaw dropped. "Ms. Hale, I have to strongly advise..." "Tom, we've been working this problem for 3 hours with no progress. Mr. Calderon. Noah Calderon. Mr. Calderon seems to understand the specific symptoms we're seeing. Given the circumstances, I think 15 minutes is a reasonable risk." Noah felt his hands start to shake slightly as the reality of the situation hit him. He was about to work on aircraft systems for the first time in over a decade, in front of an audience that included his new CEO and 137 stranded passengers. If he was wrong about the diagnosis, his credibility would be destroyed. If he was right but couldn't execute the fix, the result would be the same. But somewhere in the gate area, a child was crying because Christmas had been disrupted by a problem Noah understood completely. And in his pocket, his father's challenge coin seemed to pulse with the weight of knowledge that demanded to be used. "I'll need access to the flight management computer interface and about 10 minutes of quiet to work through the reset sequence," Noah said, "and maybe someone to document what I'm doing, in case it needs to be repeated." Victoria smiled for the first time since Noah had seen her. "Tom, please escort Mr. Calderon to the aircraft. And Tom, get someone to video the procedure. If this works, we're going to want to understand exactly what he did." As Noah walked across the tarmac toward the CRJ-700, he could feel the weight of 137 sets of eyes following his progress. The diagnostic tablet in his hands felt both foreign and familiar, like returning to a language he'd once spoken fluently but hadn't practiced in years. The challenge coin pressed against his chest, with each step carrying the accumulated weight of 12 years of roads not taken and expertise left unused. But for the first time in over a decade, Noah Calderon was walking toward an aircraft not to load baggage or push back from the gate, but to do what he'd always been meant to do. Fix the problem. Get people home. Make the machines sing their proper songs. The aircraft's cabin felt like stepping into a time machine. Noah hadn't been inside a cockpit since his contractor days, but the familiar layout of switches, displays, and system panels triggered muscle memory he'd thought was lost. The captain, a graying man, with the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible emergency, watched with professional curiosity as Noah settled into the jump seat behind the center console. "I'm Captain Richards," the pilot said. "My first officer, Sarah Chen. We've been cycling through the startup sequence for the past hour with no luck." Noah nodded, accepting the diagnostic tablet from the mechanic. The screen displayed a cascade of error codes that would have looked like hieroglyphics to most people but told Noah a clear story. "When did the problem first manifest?" "During our pre-flight systems check," First Officer Chen replied. "Everything powered up normally, but the flight management system wouldn't complete initialization." We've tried multiple restart sequences, even pulled the circuit breakers and reset everything. Classic timing conflict, Noah murmured, scrolling through the error log. The FMS is trying to sync with the air data computer and the navigation database simultaneously, but there's a priority dispute in the data bus architecture. He looked up to find 3 pairs of eyes staring at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Through the cockpit window, he could see Victoria Hale standing in the jetway, arms crossed, watching his every move. Beyond her, passengers pressed against the terminal windows, their collective anxiety almost palpable. "Walk me through exactly what happens during startup," Noah said, his fingers already moving across the diagnostic interface with growing confidence. For the next 10 minutes, Noah methodically worked through the system architecture, isolating each component's initialization sequence and identifying the conflict points. His movements became more fluid as forgotten skills resurged, years of theoretical knowledge melding with hands-on experience in a way that felt both natural and revelatory. "There," he said finally, pointing to a specific line in the diagnostic code. "Bus priority table corrupted during the last software update. The FMS and ADCS are trying to claim the same data pathway simultaneously. Watch this." Noah's fingers danced across the interface, manually resetting the bus priorities, and then initiating a staged restart sequence, FMS first, followed by navigation systems, then air data computers in precise 15-second intervals. The cockpit displays flickered, went dark, then began illuminating in sequence as each system came online cleanly. "Flight management system initialization complete," the FMS announced in its synthetic voice. "Database current, navigation ready." Captain Richard stared at his now functional displays with something approaching awe. "How did you know to do that?" "Experience with similar systems," Noah replied, but his heart was hammering with the rush of solving a complex technical problem. The bus architecture in military aircraft has the same vulnerability. Once you've seen the failure pattern, the fix becomes obvious. First Officer Chen was already running through her checklist, confirming that all systems were responding normally. "Everything looks good. We're showing normal function across all flight management interfaces." The cockpit door opened, and Victoria Hale appeared with the lead mechanic in tow. "Status report?" "Problem resolved," Captain Richard said, still shaking his head in amazement. "Mr. Calderon identified a software conflict and manually corrected the bus priority settings. We're ready for departure." Victoria's expression was unreadable as she studied the now functional displays. "How long did that take?" Noah checked his watch. 12 minutes. 12 minutes to solve a problem that stumped our maintenance team for 3 hours. Victoria's voice carried a note of something surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "Mr. Calderon, I think we need to talk." An hour later, Noah found himself in Victoria's temporary office, actually, a converted conference room in the airport's administrative wing. The space was spartanly furnished with a folding table, 2 chairs, and a laptop computer that looked like it had traveled extensively. Victoria sat across from him, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands and an expression of focused attention on her face. "Tell me about your background," she said without preamble. Noah had been dreading this conversation since the moment the FMS came back online. "Air Force, like I said, avionics specialist with the 355th Aircraft Maintenance Squadron. Worked primarily on F-16s and A-10s. After my service, I did contractor work for various aerospace companies, Boeing, Lockheed, some smaller firms." "And you ended up handling baggage, how?" The question hit like a physical blow, forcing Noah to confront the series of compromises that had led him here. Life happened. My son was born, my marriage fell apart, and I needed stable work that would let me be present for him. Baggage handling provided that stability. Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying him with the calculating gaze of someone who made career-defining decisions daily. "What's your current technical certification status?" "Expired." The admission felt like confessing to a crime. I let my FAA certifications lapse about 8 years ago, couldn't justify the renewal costs when I wasn't working in the field. But your knowledge clearly hasn't lapsed. Knowledge doesn't expire, experience doesn't either, apparently. Noah fingered the temporary contractor badge that security had issued him for the aircraft access. The plastic felt substantial in his hands, like a tangible connection to the professional world he'd abandoned. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her coffee cup in a rhythm that suggested rapid mental calculation. Noah, may I call you Noah? I'm going to be direct with you. Mountain Air is facing some significant challenges. She opened her laptop and turned it toward him. The screen displayed a series of charts and graphs that painted a picture of an airline in crisis. On-time performance was declining, maintenance costs were rising, and customer satisfaction scores were dropping toward industry-low levels. We've had 17 mechanical delays in the past month alone, Victoria continued, most of them involving complex systems issues that our current maintenance teams struggle to diagnose efficiently. Problems that should take 30 minutes are taking 3 hours. Problems that should cost hundreds of dollars are costing thousands. Noah studied the data, his engineer's mind automatically looking for patterns and root causes. Looks like you have a systemic training issue. Modern aircraft systems are becoming more integrated and software-dependent, but many maintenance teams are still approaching problems with hardware-focused thinking. Exactly. Victoria's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd found a kindred, analytical spirit. We need people who understand both the legacy mechanical systems and the modern software integration, people who can bridge that gap. Noah felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the excitement of a complex problem that demanded innovative solutions. But reality quickly reasserted itself. That sounds like a fascinating challenge, but I'm not sure how it relates to me. I'm baggage handling, remember? What if you weren't? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Noah wasn't sure he was ready to consider. Ms. Hale, Victoria. Victoria, I appreciate the confidence you're showing in me, but I have responsibilities. My son depends on the stability of my current position. I can't just... I'm not asking you to make any permanent decisions, Victoria interrupted, but I have an immediate problem that your skills could help solve, and it might benefit both of us. She turned the laptop back toward herself and pulled up another set of data. We're facing a potential fleet-wide software issue, similar to what you just fixed, but affecting multiple aircraft types across our entire operation. Our IT department thinks it's related to a recent update to our flight management software, but they can't isolate the specific problem. Noah leaned forward despite himself. How widespread? 12 aircraft showing intermittent symptoms over the past week. If the pattern continues, we could be looking at significant operational disruptions right in the middle of peak holiday travel. The FAA is already asking questions about our reliability metrics. The implications were staggering. A fleet-wide grounding during the holidays would strand thousands of passengers and potentially bankrupt a regional airline already operating on thin margins. Noah found himself mentally cataloguing the possible failure modes and diagnostic approaches before catching himself. What exactly are you proposing? Victoria closed the laptop and leaned forward, her expression shifting to the focused intensity of someone making a critical business decision. A consulting contract. 24 hours to help us identify and resolve the fleet issue. You'd work directly with our senior maintenance team and have full access to aircraft systems and diagnostic data. 24 hours? Noah's mind raced through the logistics. That would mean working through Christmas Day. I understand that's a significant ask. But Noah, if we can't solve this problem quickly, we're looking at the possibility of grounding our entire fleet. That would mean thousands of passengers stranded during the holidays and dozens of employees losing their jobs in the new year. Noah thought about Matteo, probably still doing homework in the employee break area, unaware that his father's world was shifting beneath his feet. The custody arrangement with Elena depended on stability, predictability, and Noah's ability to demonstrate that he could provide a secure environment for their son. But he also thought about the faces in Gate B17th, crying infant, the military serviceman, the elderly couple holding hands and hoping to make it home for Christmas. How many similar faces would be disappointed if Mountain Air's fleet went down? What would the compensation be? $50,000. Noah nearly choked on his coffee. $50,000? For one day of work? For potentially saving the company. And Noah, there's something else you should know. Victoria's expression grew serious. If this consulting arrangement works out, if you can help us resolve the fleet issue, I'd like to discuss a permanent position, Chief Technical Officer, reporting directly to me. Full benefits, competitive salary, and the kind of technical challenges that would make use of everything you know. The temporary contractor badge in Noah's hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Chief Technical Officer. A title that represented everything he'd walked away from 12 years ago, everything he'd convinced himself he didn't want anymore. I need to think about this, Noah said, his voice barely steady. Of course. But Noah, I need an answer by tomorrow morning. Christmas Day or not, we can't afford to wait much longer. As Noah walked back through the terminal toward the employee break area, his mind churned with possibilities and complications. The badge in his pocket felt like a tangible symbol of a crossroads-zone path leading back to the stable, predictable life he'd built around Matteo's needs. The other toward the kind of professional challenge he'd thought was permanently beyond his reach. Matteo looked up from his homework as Noah approached, his perceptive eyes immediately noting his father's troubled expression. "Dad, you look different. Did something happen?" Noah settled into the chair across from his son, struggling to find words for a conversation he'd never expected to have. Something unexpected came up at work today. An opportunity. What kind of opportunity? The kind that could change things for us, maybe make things better, maybe make them more complicated. Matteo closed his workbook and studied his father with the unsettling perception that had become familiar over the years. It's about fixing airplanes, isn't it? How did you... You have that look again, but different this time, less sad. Noah reached across the table and took his son's hand. "Mijo, what would you think if Dad had a chance to go back to working on airplanes? It would mean some changes, some uncertainty, but it might also mean better opportunities for both of us." Matteo was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications with the seriousness of a child who'd learned early that life required difficult choices. "Would you be happier?" he asked finally. The question cut straight to the heart of everything Noah had been avoiding for 12 years. Would he be happier? Or had he become so comfortable with compromise that he'd forgotten what fulfillment felt like? "I think I might be," Noah admitted, "but only if it doesn't hurt what we have together. You're still the most important thing in my life." "Then maybe you should try," Matteo said, with the simple wisdom that only children possess. "Grandpa always said you were meant to fix airplanes. Maybe it's time to listen to him." As Noah looked at his son, this remarkable child, who'd shaped every decision of the past decade, he felt the temporary contractor badge pressing against his chest like a promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and the possibility of reclaiming a piece of himself he'd thought was permanently lost. But tonight, he was still a baggage handler with a son to raise and a life built on careful compromises. The question was whether he had the courage to risk everything safe and predictable for the chance to soar again. Christmas morning arrived, grey and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that made airport operations feel even more industrial than usual. Noah stood in his small kitchen, staring at his phone and the text message from Victoria that had arrived at 6 a.m. "Decision time. Fleet showing 3 more incidents overnight. Need you here by 8, if you're in." Matteo sat at their small dining table, quietly eating cereal while watching his father wrestle with a choice that would reshape their lives. The boy had inherited his father's ability to read situations, and the tension in the apartment was as thick as the coffee Noah wasn't drinking. "You're scared," Matteo observed, not looking up from his bowl. "Terrified," Noah admitted. There was no point in hiding his uncertainty from a child who saw through pretense like it was glass. Mom called last night. Noah's spoon clinked against his mug. Elena rarely called on holidays, preferring to maintain the carefully negotiated boundaries of their shared custody arrangement. What did she say? She heard about you fixing the airplane. It's on the news. Matteo pulled out his phony a basic model Noah had reluctantly provided for safety. Reason San showed his father a local news website. The headline read, "Baggage handler saves Christmas flight with quick thinking." The article was brief but accurate, describing how an airport employee had diagnosed and resolved a complex technical problem that had stumped certified mechanics. Noah's name was mentioned, along with his background as a former Air Force avionics specialist. The piece concluded with speculation about whether this represented a broader skill gap in the aviation maintenance industry. "Mom said she was proud of you." The words hit Noah like a physical blow. Elena had been many things during their marriage's abortive. Frustrated, understanding, resentful but proud hadn't been one of them toward the end. She'd watched him choose financial security over professional fulfillment, stability over ambition, and had grown increasingly distant as he'd settled into what she called playing it safe. She also said that if you want to try something new, she won't fight you in court about it. Noah sat down hard in the chair across from his son. She said that maybe it was time for you to stop being afraid of your own talents. The handwritten diagnostic notes in Matteo's school notebook lay open beside his serial bold-crude sketches of aircraft systems that Noah had drawn while helping with a science project about flight. They'd used the notebook because Noah didn't have proper engineering paper at home, hadn't needed it for years. But the diagrams were precise, detailed, showing the interconnections between hydraulic, electrical, and flight control systems with the clarity of someone who understood machines at their deepest level. "Are you going to take the job?" Matteo asked. "It's not exactly a job. It's a consulting contract, one day to help solve a technical problem." After that, Noah spread his hands, unsure how to explain the complexity of the situation to a 10-year-old. But it could become a job. It could, or it could be a disaster that ruins everything stable we've built. Matteo pushed his notebook toward his father, pointing to one of the sketches a cross-section of a turbofan engine with carefully labeled components. "You drew this without looking anything up. You knew where every part went, how everything connected. That's not something you can just stop being good at." At 7:30 a.m., Noah made the call. "Victoria, it's Noah Calderon. I'm in." 2 hours later, Noah found himself in Mountain Air's primary maintenance hangar, surrounded by the organized chaos of an airline trying to diagnose a fleet-wide technical crisis. 3 aircraft sat in various states of disassembly, their engine cowlings open and diagnostic equipment scattered around them like electronic tumbleweeds. The senior maintenance supervisor, a gruff man named Frank Morrison, greeted Noah with barely concealed hostility. "So you're the miracle worker who's going to solve our problems in one day." "I'm the guy who's going to try," Noah replied evenly. "Show me what you've got." For the next hour, Frank walked Noah through the symptoms affecting the fleet. The problems were inconsistent, seemingly random, and growing more frequent. Some aircraft experienced flight management system glitches, similar to yesterday's incident. Others showed anomalies in autopilot engagement, navigation, database corruption, or communication system dropouts. "It's like the aircraft are developing Alzheimer's," Frank said, his frustration evident. "Systems that worked perfectly yesterday suddenly can't remember their basic functions." Noah studied the diagnostic reports, looking for patterns that might not be obvious to technicians focused on individual aircraft. The handwritten notes in Matteo's notebook had reminded him of something important sometimes. The most complex problems had elegantly simple solutions, if you could see the underlying architecture clearly. "When did the problems start?" he asked. "About 10 days ago, right after we implemented the latest software update from the manufacturer." "And the update was supposed to do what?" Frank consulted his paperwork. "Improve fuel efficiency calculations and enhance navigation accuracy. Routine stuff. We've done dozens of these updates over the years. Noah nodded, but his engineer's instincts were already suggesting a different narrative. Can you show me the update documentation? What Frank produced was a stack of technical papers thick enough to stop a bullet, filled with the kind of dense engineering language that made most people's eyes glaze over. But Noah read through the documentation with the focused intensity of someone who spoke this particular dialect fluently. After 30 minutes, he found what he was looking for. Here, he said, pointing to a specific section in the update notes. Bus, timing modifications to improve system response times. They adjusted the data flow priorities without accounting for aircraft-specific hardware variations. Frank squinted at the technical language. Meaning what exactly? Meaning the update assumes all aircraft in the fleet have identical hardware configurations. But older aircraft have different data bus architectures than newer ones. The update works fine on new planes, but creates timing conflicts on older systems. So, we need to roll back the update? Not necessarily. The improvements are actually valuable. They just need to be implemented differently for different aircraft configurations. Noah was already mentally designing a solution. His long-dormant engineering skills, engaging with the problem like puzzle pieces, clicking into place. How long would that take? Noah looked around the hangar at the 3 aircraft awaiting diagnosis. Give me access to your fleet configuration database, and about 6 hours. I can create aircraft-specific timing parameters that will allow the update to work correctly across your entire fleet. Frank's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious hope. You can really do that? I can really do that. But as Noah settled in at a workstation with access to Mountain Air's technical systems, he realized that solving the technical problem was only the beginning of his challenges. Word of his presence in the maintenance hangar had spread quickly through the airport, and not everyone was pleased with an outsider being brought in to address critical safety systems. The union representative, a stern woman named Carol Washington, appeared at his workstation an hour into his analysis. Mr. Calderon, I need to discuss some concerns with your presence here. Noah looked up from the computer screen where he'd been mapping bus timing sequences for different aircraft configurations. What concerns? You're not a certified Mountain Air employee. You don't have current FAA maintenance certifications. And you're performing work that should be done by our qualified technicians. I'm not performing maintenance, Noah replied carefully. I'm analyzing software configurations and creating timing parameters. It's essentially programming work. Work that affects flight safety systems. Work that requires proper certification and oversight. Noah understood Carol's position. She was protecting her members' jobs and ensuring safety protocols were followed. But he also understood that bureaucratic niceties wouldn't help if Mountain Air's entire fleet was grounded. Carol, right? He said, standing to face her directly. I appreciate your concerns about protocol. But right now, your airline has 12 aircraft showing symptoms of a potentially dangerous software conflict. If we can't resolve this quickly, the FAA might ground the entire fleet as a safety precaution. That's exactly why this work should be done by certified professionals following established procedures. Your certified professionals have been working on this for 10 days with no progress, Noah pointed out. Sometimes you need someone with a different perspective. The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's arrival, along with Frank Morrison and 2 other managers Noah didn't recognize. Victoria's expression was tense, and she carried herself with the controlled urgency of someone dealing with a crisis. Status report, she said, without preamble. I've identified the root cause, Noah replied. Software update created timing conflicts on older aircraft. I'm developing aircraft-specific parameters that should resolve the issue across the fleet. How confident are you in this solution? Very confident. The technical approach is sound, and I've seen similar fixes work on military systems with comparable architecture. Victoria nodded, but her expression remained troubled. We have a complication. The FAA received multiple reports about our reliability issues overnight. They're sending an inspector tomorrow to review our maintenance procedures and potentially impose operational restrictions. The implications hit NOAA like a cold wave. An FAA investigation would scrutinize every aspect of Mountain Air's operations, including any irregular maintenance procedures or unauthorized personnel working on safety systems. His presence in the hangar, while technically legal as a contractor, might be viewed unfavorably by federal regulators focused on proper certification and protocol compliance. There's more, Victoria continued. Our insurance company is asking questions about the fleet issues. If they determine that we're operating aircraft with known software problems, they might suspend coverage. NOAA looked around the hangar at the complex machinery that represented millions of dollars in assets and thousands of jobs. The solution to their technical problem was within reach. He could probably have the aircraft-specific timing parameters ready by evening. But the regulatory and legal complications were mounting faster than he could address them. "What do you need from me?" he asked Victoria. "Finish the technical solution as quickly as possible. Frank will coordinate testing on one aircraft to validate your approach. If it works, we'll implement it across the fleet before the FAA inspector arrives." Carol Washington stepped forward. "Ms. Hale, I have to formally object to this approach. Having uncertified personnel perform critical system modifications violates both union agreements and federal regulations." "Carol, I understand your position," Victoria replied, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to navigating complex organizational dynamics. "But Mr. Calderon isn't performing maintenance. He's providing technical consulting on software configuration. Any actual system modifications will be performed by your certified technicians following his specifications." It was a careful distinction, but one that NOAA recognized as legally sound. He would develop the solution. The certified mechanics would implement it. The arrangement satisfied regulatory requirements while still allowing his expertise to address the technical problem. "I need something in writing documenting that arrangement," Carol said, "and I want one of our senior technicians working with Mr. Calderon throughout the process." "Agreed," Victoria said. "Frank, assign your best avionics specialist to work with NOAA. Make sure everything is properly documented and follows established procedures." Frank nodded and walked toward a workstation where a woman in coveralls was reviewing diagnostic printouts. "Sarah, I need you over here." Sarah Chen turned out to be Frank's daughter, a certified avionics technician with 15 years of experience and the same methodical approach to problem-solving that NOAA had seen in her father. She greeted NOAA with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism. "So you're the guy who fixed yesterday's FMS problem," she said, settling at the workstation beside him. "Guilty as charged. And now you think you can solve our fleet-wide issues in one day. I think I can identify the technical solution. Implementing it across 12 aircraft will require a team effort." Sarah studied the diagnostic data NOAA had compiled, her expression gradually shifting from skepticism to interest. "You're saying the software update is causing bus timing conflicts on older aircraft?" "Exactly. The update assumes uniform hardware configurations, but your fleet has 3 different avionics architectures spanning 15 years of aircraft evolution." "That actually makes sense," Sarah admitted. "We've noticed that the newer 700 series aircraft aren't showing problems, while the older 200s and 500s are having multiple issues." For the next 2 hours, NOAA and Sarah worked together to map the specific timing requirements for each aircraft configuration. The collaboration was surprisingly smooth. Sarah's practical knowledge of Mountain Air's specific systems complemented NOAA's theoretical understanding of the underlying software architecture. As they worked, NOAA found himself remembering why he'd fallen in love with aviation technology in the first place. The elegant complexity of modern aircraft systems, the way multiple computers and sensors work together to enable flight, the satisfaction of diagnosing and solving problems that kept people connected across vast distances, it all felt like returning to a language he'd once spoken fluently. "Got it," Sarah said finally, reviewing the timing parameters NOAA had calculated for the 200 series aircraft. These settings should eliminate the bus conflicts while preserving the efficiency improvements from the update. Ready to test. Sarah looked at her father, who had been monitoring their progress with growing optimism. Frank nodded toward the nearest aircrafter CRJ-200 that had been showing intermittent FMS problems for the past week. Let's see if your theory works in practice. The next hour passed in a blur of technical precision and growing excitement. Sarah implemented Noah's timing parameters while he monitored system responses, and Frank documented every step of the process. The aircraft's computers came online cleanly, with none of the initialization errors that had plagued the fleet for the past 10 days. All systems showing normal operation, Sarah reported, running through a comprehensive diagnostic sequence. Navigation, communication, flight management, everything's responding correctly. Frank called Victoria with the news, and within minutes the maintenance hangar was buzzing with activity as additional aircraft were prepared for the updated timing parameters. Noah found himself at the center of organized chaos, fielding questions from technicians and managers, while Sarah led teams through the implementation process. But even as the technical solution proved successful, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a precipice. The temporary contractor badge in his pocket felt substantial, but also fragile, a tenuous connection to a world he'd walked away from years ago. His phone buzzed with a text from Matteo. "How's it going? Mom's making Christmas dinner if you want to come by later." The message hit Noah with unexpected emotion. Elena was extending an olive branch, acknowledging his professional achievement in a way she hadn't done in years. But it also reminded him of the life he'd built outside the hangar, quiet, stable, centered around his son's needs rather than his own ambitions. Second thoughts? Victoria appeared at his elbow, having observed his momentary distraction. "Just thinking about the implications," Noah replied. "This consulting work, the potential permanent position it, would change everything for my son and me." "Change how?" Noah gestured around the hangar at the controlled chaos of aircraft maintenance. "This world requires complete commitment. Long hours, travel, constant learning to keep up with evolving technology. I walked away from it once because I couldn't balance professional demands with being the father Matteo needed. And now he's older, more independent, but he's also approaching the teenage years, when he'll need stability and consistency more than ever. I'm not sure I can risk disrupting what we've built together." Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching Sarah's team successfully update another aircraft's timing parameters. "Noah, can I share something personal?" He nodded. "I spent 10 years climbing the corporate ladder at a major airline, working 80-hour weeks, and missing most of my daughter's childhood. I told myself I was building a better future for our family, but really, I was just pursuing my own ambitions and using her welfare as justification." Victoria's expression grew distant. By the time I realized what I'd sacrificed, she was 16 and barely knew me. We're still rebuilding that relationship. "So you think I should stick with baggage handling?" "I think you should be honest about your motivations. Are you considering this opportunity because it would make you happy, or because you think it would be better for Matteo?" "Because, in my experience, children benefit more from having parents who are fulfilled and engaged than from having parents who are safely miserable." Before Noah could respond, Frank Morrison approached with news that would complicate everything further. "Noah, we just got word from the FAA inspector. She's arriving tonight instead of tomorrow. Wants to review all maintenance activities performed in the past 48 hours, including any consulting work done by outside contractors." The temporary contractor badge in Noah's pocket suddenly felt like evidence in a criminal investigation. Everything he'd accomplished in the past day would be scrutinized by federal regulators focused on proper certification and protocol compliance. "What does that mean for the fleet modifications?" Noah asked. "It means we need to have everything documented perfectly before she arrives," Frank replied. "Every timing parameter change, every diagnostic test, every procedural step. If there are any irregularities, she could ground the entire fleet pending a full investigation." As evening approached and the maintenance teams worked feverishly to complete the fleet updates, Noah realized that his 24-hour consulting contract had evolved into something much larger and more complex. The technical problem was solved, but the regulatory, legal, and personal implications were just beginning to unfold. The handwritten diagnostic notes in Mateo's notebook had started this journey, but where it would end remained entirely uncertain. The FAA inspector arrived at 9 p.m. on Christmas Day, carrying a briefcase that looked substantial enough to contain the regulatory fate of Mountain Air's entire operation. Inspector Janet Rodriguez was a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and the methodical demeanor of someone who had built a career on finding problems that others preferred to overlook. Noah watched from the maintenance office as Victoria greeted the inspector at the hangar entrance, their conversation too distant to hear but clearly tense. Frank Morrison stood nearby with a stack of documentation thick enough to serve as a phone book, while Sarah Chen made final checks on the aircraft systems they'd updated throughout the day. Nervous? Carol Washington appeared beside Noah, her earlier hostility replaced by something approaching concern. Terrified, Noah admitted. If Inspector Rodriguez determines that our consulting arrangement violated federal regulations, it won't just affect Mountain Air. It could impact my ability to work in aviation anywhere. Maybe you should have thought about that before working on safety systems without proper certification. Maybe, Noah agreed, but 12 aircraft with software problems would have been a bigger safety issue than one uncertified consultant trying to help solve them. Carol studied him with the appraising look of someone reconsidering her initial judgment. You really believe you did the right thing? I believe I prevented a worse problem. Whether the FAA sees it that way remains to be determined. Inspector Rodriguez spent the next 2 hours reviewing every piece of documentation Frank's team had prepared. She examined the original software update files, the diagnostic reports showing fleet-wide problems, Noah's timing parameter calculations, and the step-by-step implementation records. Her expression remained carefully neutral throughout the process, offering no hints about her conclusions. Noah found himself relegated to observer status, watching from the maintenance office while his professional fate was decided by conversations he couldn't hear. The encrypted USB drive hidden in the maintenance records, which Frank had shown him earlier, contained additional information about the software problems, but Noah hadn't had time to examine its contents thoroughly. Mr. Calderon? Inspector Rodriguez appeared in the office doorway, her tone giving nothing away. I'd like to speak with you. The conversation took place in a small conference room adjacent to the hangar, with Victoria and Frank present as witnesses. Inspector Rodriguez opened a recorder and stated the time, date, and participants for the record. Mr. Calderon, please describe your role in the aircraft modifications performed over the past 24 hours. Noah had rehearsed this moment mentally, knowing that his words would be scrutinized for any hint of regulatory violation. I served as a technical consultant, analyzing software timing conflicts and developing configuration parameters to resolve fleet-wide system problems. All actual aircraft modifications were performed by certified Mountain Air technicians following established procedures. And your qualifications for this consulting work? Former Air Force avionics specialist with experience on military flight management systems, previous contractor work with commercial aerospace manufacturers on similar technical issues. Inspector Rodriguez made notes without comment. Are you currently certified to perform maintenance on commercial aircraft? No, ma'am. My FAA certifications expired several years ago when I left the aviation industry. Yet you felt qualified to develop solutions for safety, critical aircraft systems? The question carried dangerous implications. Noah chose his words carefully. I felt qualified to analyze software architecture and identify timing conflicts. The actual implementation was performed by certified personnel who verified my analysis before making any system modifications. Walk me through your diagnostic process. For the next hour, Noah explained his analysis of the fleet problems, from identifying the root cause in the software update to developing aircraft-specific timing parameters. Inspector Rodriguez asked detailed questions about his methodology, his assumptions, and his confidence in the solutions he'd proposed. "Have you examined all the maintenance records for the affected aircraft?" she asked. "I've reviewed the records Frank Morrison provided, focusing on the symptoms related to the software conflicts." "All the records?" Something in her tone suggested deeper implications. Noah glanced at Frank, who looked uncomfortable. "I believe so. Are there additional records I should have seen?" Inspector Rodriguez exchanged a look with Victoria before responding. "Mr. Morrison, please provide Mr. Calderon with access to the complete maintenance database, including the files you've been keeping separately." Frank's face flushed. "Inspector, those files contain preliminary investigations that haven't been verified." "Mr. Morrison, either you provide complete access to your maintenance records, or I suspend your operation until I can conduct a full audit of your documentation practices." 20 minutes later, Noah found himself staring at the contents of the encrypted USB drive with growing alarm. The hidden files contained maintenance reports dating back 18 months, documenting a pattern of software-related problems that went far beyond the recent fleet issues. According to the records, Mountain Air had experienced sporadic FMS failures, navigation anomalies, and communication system glitches for over a year. The problems had been treated as isolated incidents, with individual aircraft receiving component replacements and software reinstalls without anyone recognizing the broader pattern. "Why wasn't this information included in the original analysis?" Noah asked Frank. "Because it's mostly speculation and preliminary findings," Frank replied defensively. "We couldn't prove a connection between the older incidents and the recent problems." But Noah could see the connections clearly now, studying the data with the pattern recognition skills his father had taught him decades ago. The older problems showed the same underlying signatures as the recent fleet issues, suggesting that the software conflicts had been building gradually over time. More disturbing was the discovery that several of the older incidents had involved near-miss situations where navigation errors or communication failures had created potentially dangerous conditions that were resolved only by pilot intervention. "Inspector Rodriguez," Noah said, his voice tight with concern, "I think we have a bigger problem than anyone realized." What Noah had uncovered suggested that the recent software update hadn't created the timing conflicts, it had simply made them more frequent and obvious. The underlying problems had been present for months, creating intermittent safety issues that hadn't been recognized as part of a systemic pattern. "How much bigger?" Inspector Rodriguez asked. Noah studied the maintenance records, mentally mapping the progression of problems across the fleet. "Based on this data, I'd estimate that Mountain Air has been operating with compromised flight management systems for at least 18 months. The recent update didn't cause the problems it revealed them." Victoria's face went pale. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your airline has been experiencing systematic software failures that created potential safety risks. The failures were infrequent enough to be dismissed as random malfunctions, but consistent enough to represent a pattern that should have been investigated." Inspector Rodriguez closed her recorder with a decisive click. "Ms. Hale, I'm imposing immediate operational restrictions on Mountain Air, pending a comprehensive investigation of your maintenance practices and safety management systems." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Operational restrictions meant that Mountain Air's aircraft would be grounded until the FAA completed its investigation, a process that could take weeks or months. For a regional airline, already operating on thin margins, such restrictions would be financially catastrophic. "Inspector, surely we can work out some arrangement that allows limited operations while addressing your concerns," Victoria said, her executive composure beginning to crack. "The scope of the safety issues described by Mr. Calderon requires a thorough investigation. I cannot allow aircraft to continue operating when there may be systematic problems affecting flight safety systems." Noah felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. His analysis had been thorough and accurate, but it had also revealed problems that would destroy the airline he'd been trying to help. "There might be another approach," he said quietly. Inspector Rodriguez turned toward him. Explain. Give me 48 hours to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the entire fleet. If I can identify all affected aircraft and develop verified solutions for each system configuration, would you consider allowing limited operations under enhanced monitoring? Mr. Calderon, you just told us that you've identified systematic safety problems dating back 18 months. Why would I allow continued operations based on analysis from someone without current certification? Noah looked around the room at faces that reflected various degrees of hope, skepticism, and desperation. Victoria's expression showed the strain of someone watching her company collapse in real time. Frank looked like a man who'd spent his career building something that was about to be destroyed by problems he hadn't recognized. Because the alternative is grounding an entire airline 3 days after Christmas, stranding thousands of passengers and putting hundreds of people out of work, Noah replied. And because I might be the only person available who has both the technical expertise to solve these problems and the motivation to do it quickly. Inspector Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, weighing regulatory caution against practical necessity. What would your analysis involve? Complete review of maintenance records for all aircraft in the fleet. Comprehensive testing of flight management systems under various operational conditions. Development of aircraft-specific solutions that address both the recent problems and the underlying issues revealed in the historical data. In 48 hours? With the right team and unrestricted access to aircraft and systems, yes. Inspector Rodriguez looked at Victoria. Ms. Hale, are you willing to accept Mr. Calderon's analysis as the basis for your continued operations? If it keeps our aircraft flying and our passengers safe, absolutely. Then I'll give you 48 hours. But Mr. Calderon, if your analysis is incomplete or inaccurate, the consequences will extend far beyond Mountain Air's operations. The FAA will hold you personally responsible for any safety issues that result from aircraft being returned to service, based on your recommendations. As the meeting broke up and Inspector Rodriguez departed for her hotel, Noah found himself alone in the conference room with the encrypted USB drive and the growing realization that he'd just committed to the most complex technical challenge of his career. 48 hours to analyze 18 months of problems across a 12-aircraft fleet. 48 hours to develop solutions that would satisfy federal regulators focused on safety above all else. 48 hours to prove that a former baggage handler could indeed bridge the gap between complex technical problems and practical solutions. The challenge coin in his pocket seemed to pulse with the accumulated weight of his father's expectations and his son's faith in his abilities. But for the first time since this journey began, Noah wasn't sure that faith was justified. Outside the hangar, snow was beginning to fall again on the Colorado landscape, dusting the grounded aircraft with a thin layer of white that made them look fragile and earthbound. Soon, those aircraft would either return to the sky based on his analysis or remain grounded as monuments to problems he'd helped reveal but couldn't solve. The next 48 hours would determine not just Mountain Air's future, but Noah's own understanding of what he was truly capable of achieving. The next morning arrived with the kind of brittle clarity that follows a sleepless night. Noah sat in the employee break room at 5 a.m., surrounded by printouts of maintenance records and laptop computers displaying diagnostic data, while Mateo slept on a makeshift bed constructed from couch cushions and airline blankets. His son had insisted on staying at the airport through the night, claiming he wanted to help, but really understanding that his father needed the comfort of familiar presence during the most challenging work of his life. Elena had surprised them both by dropping off dinner and fresh clothes around midnight, staying long enough to see Noah's complete immersion in the technical analysis before quietly offering her support. "You look like you're drowning in paperwork," Victoria said, appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee that smelled stronger than anything the vending machines could produce. 18 months of maintenance records across 12 aircraft, Noah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Every component replacement, every software update, every anomaly report. I'm looking for patterns that nobody else recognized because they were spread across time and different aircraft. Victoria settled into the chair across from him, careful not to disturb the carefully organized stacks of documentation. What have you found? Noah pulled out a hand-drawn timeline he'd constructed during the NITR complex chart, mapping aircraft tail numbers against maintenance events and reported problems. The issues started about 20 months ago, shortly after Mountain Air implemented a new maintenance tracking system. The software conflicts weren't caused by a recent update. They were caused by cumulative changes to aircraft configurations that nobody was tracking systematically. Meaning that each aircraft in your fleet has been modified slightly over time. Different software versions, different hardware components, different timing configurations. The modifications were all approved individually, but nobody looked at how they might interact with each other. Victoria studied the timeline, her expression growing increasingly troubled. So, we've been flying aircraft with incompatible system configurations. Not incompatible exactly, but suboptimal. The systems work most of the time, but under certain conditions, specific combinations of altitude, temperature, and workload, they create conflicts that manifest as the failures we've been seeing. Noah pointed to specific entries on his timeline. Look at this pattern. Aircraft with older flight management systems show problems primarily during winter operations at high-altitude airports. Aircraft with newer systems show problems during heavy traffic conditions when multiple navigation systems are active simultaneously. That's remarkably specific. It's also completely predictable once you understand the underlying architecture. Noah felt the familiar excitement of solving complex puzzles, the same sensation he'd experienced as a child working alongside his father in the garage. The problems aren't random, they're the logical result of system configurations that were never designed to work together. Victoria was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implications. If you're right, then we've been treating symptoms instead of causes for almost 2 years. Exactly, and Inspector Rodriguez was correct to be concerned. Some of these configuration conflicts do represent potential safety risks. Noah pulled out another document, his father's old flight logbook, which he'd retrieved from home during a brief break around 2 a.m. The leather-bound book contained detailed notes about aircraft systems and maintenance procedures from Miguel Calderon's years as a test pilot. My father died in a crash caused by a flight management system failure, Noah said quietly. I never understood the technical details until last night. Victoria's expression shifted to one of careful attention. What did you discover? Noah opened the logbook to a page marked with a faded bookmark. He was flying a prototype aircraft with a new navigation system that hadn't been properly integrated with the existing autopilot software. The system worked perfectly during normal operations, but under specific stress conditions, it created a control conflict that the pilots couldn't resolve. The same type of problem you're seeing in Mountain Air's fleet. The same underlying issue: incompatible system configurations that create unpredictable failures under stress conditions. Noah's voice carried the weight of 20-year-old grief, finally finding resolution. My father was investigating the system integration problems when he died. His notes describe exactly the kind of comprehensive analysis I'm doing now. Victoria reached across the table and touched Noah's hand briefly. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm grateful that his work is helping us prevent similar problems. Noah closed the logbook and returned his attention to the maintenance timeline. I think I can solve Mountain Air's technical problems, but there's something else you need to know. What? The systematic nature of these issues suggests they weren't accidental. Someone with detailed knowledge of aircraft systems would have had to deliberately introduce incompatible configurations across multiple aircraft over an extended period. Victoria's face went pale. You're suggesting sabotage? I'm suggesting that the maintenance records show patterns that are too consistent to be random. Either Mountain Air has been extraordinarily unlucky with component failures and software conflicts, or someone has been deliberately creating system vulnerabilities. Noah showed Victoria a specific section of his analysis, chart tracking component replacements across the fleet. Look at this pattern. Over the past 18 months, specific components have been replaced on multiple aircraft with versions that are technically compatible but create timing conflicts when combined with other system updates. Who would have access to make those kinds of modifications? Someone with maintenance authorization, detailed knowledge of aircraft systems, and access to parts inventory. Probably someone inside Mountain Air who understood how to create problems that would look like random failures. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, studying the documentation with the focused intensity of someone whose world was shifting beneath her feet. If you're right, then we're dealing with more than technical problems. We're dealing with deliberate sabotage aimed at destroying the airline. Or at destroying confidence in your leadership, Noah suggested. You're the new CEO. If the fleet problems get bad enough, the board might decide you're not the right person to lead the company. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious pattern in the data. Victoria stood and walked to the window overlooking the maintenance hangar, where crews were preparing aircraft for Noah's comprehensive testing program. What do you need to prove your theory? Access to personnel records for everyone with maintenance authorization. Detailed review of parts procurement and installation procedures. And about 12 more hours of analysis to map the specific system modifications. You'll have whatever you need. Noah looked at his sleeping son, curled up on the makeshift bed with the innocent trust of a child who believed his father could solve any problem. Victoria, if I'm right about the sabotage, then solving the technical problems won't be enough. Whoever's been creating these system conflicts will just find new ways to cause problems. Then we'll have to identify them and stop them. And if we can't? Victoria's expression hardened with the determination of someone who hadn't climbed to the CEO level by backing down from difficult challenges. Then we'll protect the airline and our passengers by whatever means necessary. For the next 6 hours, Noah immersed himself in the most complex forensic analysis of his career. Using techniques his father had taught him, and knowledge gained through years of aircraft maintenance, he systematically traced every system modification across Mountain Air's fleet. The pattern that emerged was both elegant and disturbing. Someone with intimate knowledge of aircraft systems had been introducing subtle incompatibilities that would create problems months or years after installation. The modifications were technically legal and individually harmless. But when combined across multiple aircraft, they created the systematic failures that had brought Mountain Air to the edge of regulatory shutdown. More importantly, Noah identified the specific maintenance authorizations used for each problematic modification. The pattern pointed to a single individual with high-level access to aircraft systems and detailed knowledge of how to create delayed failures. "I know who's been sabotaging your aircraft," Noah told Victoria when she returned to check on his progress. "Who?" Noah showed her a maintenance authorization log that he'd cross-referenced with the timeline of system modifications. "Richard Banning, your Director of Maintenance Operations. He's the only person with sufficient access and technical knowledge to have orchestrated this pattern of sabotage." Victoria stared at the documentation with the expression of someone whose trust had been systematically betrayed. "Richard's been with the company for 15 years. He was one of the people I relied on most when I took over as CEO, which would make him the perfect person to undermine your leadership by creating problems that made the airline look incompetent under your management." But why? What would he gain from destroying Mountain Air? Noah had been considering that question throughout his analysis. Maybe he expected to be promoted to a senior position when you were hired. Maybe he has connections with a competitor who wants to acquire Mountain Air's roots, or maybe he's just bitter about working under a female CEO. Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the caller ID, and her expression grew even more troubled. "It's Richard. He's asking about the status of our analysis and whether the aircraft will be cleared for operations today." "Perfect timing," Noah said grimly. "He's probably wondering whether his sabotage has succeeded in destroying the airline." As Victoria prepared to answer the call, Noah felt the challenge coin press against his chest with the accumulated weight of decisions that would determine not just Mountain Air's future, but his own understanding of what he was capable of achieving. The technical problems were solved, but the human ones were just beginning. Outside the break room window, Inspector Rodriguez was returning to the hangar for her scheduled review of Noah's analysis. In a few hours, she would decide whether Mountain Air's fleet could return to service based on solutions developed by a former baggage handler working with borrowed expertise and borrowed time. But first, they would have to confront the reality that Mountain Air's problems weren't just technical, they were personal, deliberate, and designed to destroy everything Victoria had been trying to build. The crash report was buried in a file cabinet that hadn't been opened in 20 years, hidden beneath layers of regulatory documents and insurance claims that time had turned into archaeological artifacts. Noah found it by accident while searching for additional maintenance records in Mountain Air's archive room, following a reference number that had appeared in his father's flight logbook. The official accident report was dated March 15, 2003. Test flight of experimental navigation system. Aircraft. F-16D Fighting Falcon. Pilot. Lieutenant Colonel Miguel Calderon. Cause. Flight management system failure during high-stress maneuver. Recommendations: enhanced integration testing for new avionics systems. But stapled to the back of the official report was something Noah had never seen before. Preliminary investigation memo marked confidential that had apparently been overlooked when the files were transferred to long-term storage. The memo was signed by Richard Banning. Noah's hands trembled as he read the document that recontextualized everything he thought he knew about his father's death. According to Banning's preliminary findings, the flight management system failure hadn't been a random malfunction or integration error. It had been the result of deliberately modified software designed to create failures under specific operational conditions. Sabotage, Noah whispered to the empty archive room. The memo detailed Banning's investigation into suspicious code found in the experimental navigation system code that shouldn't have been present and served no functional purpose except to create timing conflicts during high-stress flight operations. Banning had recommended a full criminal investigation, but according to handwritten notes in the margin, his findings had been dismissed by senior officials who preferred to attribute the crash to pilot error and system complexity. Noah photographed every page of the document with his phone, his mind racing through implications that stretched back 2 decades. If Banning had been investigating sabotage in 2003, then the current problems at Mountain Air weren't Richard's first encounter with deliberately modified aircraft systems. But why would Banning investigate sabotage and then later become a saboteur himself? The contradiction didn't make sense unless Noah, Victoria's voice echoed through the archive room. Inspector Rodriguez is asking for you. She wants to review your analysis before making her decision about the fleet. Noah carefully replaced the crash report file and walked toward the maintenance hangar with his mind churning through possibilities he hadn't previously considered. If Banning had been investigating aircraft sabotage 20 years ago, then he might have learned techniques that he later used for his own purposes. Or perhaps the sabotage had never stopped, perhaps it had simply evolved and found new targets. Inspector Rodriguez was waiting in the conference room with Frank Morrison and Sarah Chen, surrounded by the comprehensive analysis Noah had prepared over the past 48 hours. His timeline charts, system diagrams, and maintenance correlations covered every available surface, like the aftermath of an academic explosion. "Mr. Calderon, I've reviewed your preliminary findings," Inspector Rodriguez said without preamble. "Your analysis of the fleet problems is impressive, but your conclusions about deliberate sabotage are extremely serious. Do you have evidence to support such allegations?" Noah had been dreading this moment, knowing that accusations of criminal sabotage would require proof that went beyond pattern recognition and technical analysis. But the crash report from his father's accident had provided exactly the evidence he needed. "Yes, ma'am, I do." Noah pulled out his phone and displayed the photographs of Banning's 2003 investigation memo. This document shows that Richard Banning was investigating aircraft sabotage 20 years ago. The techniques described in his findings are identical to the methods used to create Mountain Air's current system conflicts. Inspector Rodriguez studied the photos with growing alarm. "Where did you find this document?" "In Mountain Air's archives, attached to the accident report for my father's crash in 2003. "Your father was the pilot killed in that test flight?" "Yes, ma'am. And according to Banning's investigation, the crash was caused by deliberately modified flight management software, the same type of sabotage affecting Mountain Air's fleet today." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Frank Morrison looked like a man who'd discovered that his trusted colleague was a criminal. Sarah Chen was staring at the maintenance records with new understanding of patterns she'd previously attributed to bad luck. "This changes everything," Inspector Rodriguez said finally. "If Mr. Banning has been systematically sabotaging aircraft systems for 2 decades, then we're dealing with a criminal conspiracy that threatens aviation safety on a much broader scale." Victoria's phone rang, interrupting the tense discussion. She glanced at the caller ID, and her expression grew even more troubled. "It's Richard again. He says he needs to speak with me immediately about urgent safety concerns." "Don't answer it," Noah said quickly. "If he knows we've discovered his sabotage, he might escalate to more direct action." "What kind of direct action?" Noah thought about the sophisticated knowledge required to modify flight management systems without detection. Someone with Banning's expertise could potentially take control of aircraft systems remotely. If he has access to Mountain Air's computer networks, he might be able to interfere with flight operations in real time. Inspector Rodriguez stood abruptly. "I'm grounding your entire fleet immediately. If there's any possibility of remote interference with aircraft systems, I cannot allow continued operations." "Wait," Victoria said. "If we ground the fleet now, Richard will know we've discovered his sabotage. He'll have time to destroy evidence and potentially target other airlines." "Miss Hale, I cannot prioritize criminal investigation over immediate safety concerns." Noah looked around the room at faces reflecting various degrees of fear, anger, and determination. The technical solutions he'd developed were sound, but they wouldn't protect against sabotage that could be activated remotely. On the other hand, grounding the fleet would alert Banning to their investigation and give him opportunity to escape prosecution. "There might be a third option," Noah said slowly. "Explain." "We implement my technical solutions but add additional security protocols that would prevent remote interference. If Banning tries to sabotage aircraft systems during flight operations, we'll detect it immediately and have evidence for criminal prosecution." "That's an enormous risk," Inspector Rodriguez pointed out. The FBI Command Center was established in a conference room at Denver International Airport that had been hastily converted into a secure operations facility. Special Agent Sarah Martinez, a 20-year veteran of cybercrime investigations, coordinated with Inspector Rodriguez and a team of federal analysts who had arrived on a red-eye flight from Washington. Noah found himself at the center of an investigation that had expanded far beyond Mountain Air's technical problems to encompass a potential terrorist attack on the nation's aviation infrastructure. The hand-drawn airplane schematic that Mateo had created for his science project sat on the conference table alongside FBI case files and classified intelligence reports, representing the intersection of a child's innocent dreams and the complex realities of aviation security. "Tell me about the sabotage techniques," Agent Martinez said, reviewing Noah's analysis of the fleet problems. "How sophisticated would someone need to be to implement these attacks?" "Extremely sophisticated," Noah replied. "They'd need deep knowledge of aircraft systems, architecture, access to software development tools, and the ability to penetrate airline computer networks without detection. We're talking about someone with both technical expertise and significant resources. How many people have that level of capability?" Noah considered the question carefully. "In the commercial aviation industry, maybe a few dozen worldwide, but if you include military contractors and government agencies, the number could be higher." Agent Martinez turned to Richard Banning, who had arrived under FBI protection after 20 years of covert investigation. "Mr. Banning, you've been tracking this conspiracy since 2003. What can you tell us about the perpetrator's identity?" Banning looked exhausted but determined, carrying himself with the weight of someone who had spent decades pursuing an enemy that remained always just beyond reach. "I believe we're dealing with someone inside the aviation software industry, someone with legitimate access to multiple airline systems who's been using that access to test attack methods." "Any specific suspects?" Dr. Marcus Webb, former military contractor who now heads software development for global aviation systems. His company provides flight management software to over a dozen major airlines, including Transglobal. Agent Martinez made notes. "What's his motive?" "Unknown, but his company has been pushing airlines to adopt new software systems that would centralize control of multiple aircraft types. If he could demonstrate that current systems are vulnerable to attack, airlines might be more willing to adopt his centralized platform." Noah felt a chill of recognition. A centralized platform would give him unprecedented access to control multiple airlines simultaneously. Instead of attacking individual aircraft, he could potentially ground entire fleets with a single command, or cause coordinated crashes during peak travel periods, Inspector Rodriguez added grimly. The implications were staggering. If Webb's plan succeeded, the resulting chaos would destroy public confidence in aviation safety and position his company as the only solution to prevent future attacks. It was corporate terrorism on a scale that could reshape the entire industry. "What's our timeline?" Noah asked. Agent Martinez consulted her secure tablet. "Transglobal's New Year's Eve operations begin in 4 days. They're planning to operate over 300 flights that evening, carrying approximately 100 passengers. If Webb launches his attack during those operations, we could be looking at casualties in the hundreds or thousands." Noah thought about Mateo's airplane schematic, drawn with the innocent enthusiasm of a child who dreamed of flight without understanding the complex vulnerabilities that made modern aviation possible. "What's our strategy to stop him?" "We need proof of Webb's intentions before we can arrest him," Agent Martinez replied. "Right now, we have circumstantial evidence and 20 years of suspicions, but nothing that would hold up in court." "What about the evidence from Mountain Air's systems?" "It shows systematic sabotage, but we can't definitively prove Webb was responsible. He's too smart to leave obvious fingerprints." Banning leaned forward. "There might be another approach. Webb thinks I'm just a maintenance director who's been helping him test attack methods. If I can get him to reveal his plans for the Transglobal attack, we'd have the evidence we need." "That's extremely dangerous," Agent Martinez pointed out. "If Webb realizes you've been investigating him, he could accelerate his timeline or target you directly. It's also our best chance to prevent the attack and protect innocent passengers." Noah looked around the command center at faces, reflecting various degrees of determination, fear, and professional calculation. The technical challenges of preventing aircraft sabotage were complex enough, but the human elements, trust, deception, and the willingness to risk everything for the greater good added layers of complexity that no engineering manual could address. "I want to help," Noah said. Agent Martinez shook her head. "Mr. Calderon, you've already provided invaluable assistance with the technical analysis. But the operational phase of this investigation requires federal law enforcement expertise. Webb doesn't know who I am. To him, I'm just a baggage handler who got lucky diagnosing some technical problems. I could approach him as someone interested in aviation security, maybe offering to share information about vulnerabilities I've discovered." "Absolutely not. The risk is too high." Victoria, who had been quietly observing the federal coordination, spoke up. "Agent Martinez, Noah understands these systems better than anyone else on your team. If Webb tries to implement real-time sabotage during the operation, you'll need someone who can counter his attacks immediately. We have technical specialists. Do you have anyone who can diagnose and resolve complex avionics problems in real time while Webb is actively trying to crash aircraft?" Victoria's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent her career making life-or-death decisions under pressure. Because that's what we're talking about. This won't be a theoretical exercise, it will be a live technical battle with passenger lives hanging in the balance. Agent Martinez was quiet for several minutes, weighing operational security against practical necessity. Mr. Calderon, if we allow your participation, it would be under strict federal oversight, with predetermined safety protocols. Understood. And you'd be working with a full FBI technical support team, not operating independently. Of course. Your son would need to be placed in protective custody during the operation. Noah felt his chest tighten. Is that really necessary? If Webb realizes you're working against him, he might target your family to force your cooperation. We can't take that risk. Noah thought about Mateo, probably still sleeping in the employee break room, trusting that his father would solve whatever technical problems the adults were discussing. The boy had already sacrificed so much for Noah's choices-missed school events, evenings spent at the airport, the uncertainty of constantly changing plans. Now Noah was considering placing him in federal protection while pursuing a terrorist who had killed his grandfather. There's something else you should know, Agent Martinez continued. Dr. Webb has requested a meeting with you. The words hit the room like a physical blow. What? He called Mountain Air this morning, claiming he heard about your technical work and wants to discuss potential collaboration on aviation security research. It could be coincidence, but it's not coincidence, Banning said grimly. He's trying to determine how much we know about his activities. If Noah has indeed identified the sabotage techniques, Webb needs to assess whether he represents a threat. Noah felt the challenge coin press against his chest as he considered the implications. Webb's request for a meeting suggested that Noah's analysis had been more accurate than he'd realized accurate enough to draw the attention of a terrorist who had been operating undetected for 20 years. When does he want to meet? Noah asked. Tomorrow afternoon. He's flying into Denver specifically for the conversation. Then that's our opportunity to gather evidence and prevent the transglobal attack. Agent Martinez studied Noah with the appraising look of someone evaluating a critical operational decision. Mr. Calderon, are you absolutely certain you want to participate in this operation? Because once you're involved, there won't be any way to protect you if things go wrong. Noah looked at Mateo's airplane schematic, thinking about the innocent enthusiasm that had created those careful drawings of flight systems and engine components. His son believed that airplanes were magical machines that connected families and enabled dreams. Noah had the opportunity to ensure that belief remained unspoiled by the reality of terrorism and sabotage. I'm certain, he said. My father died investigating this conspiracy. I'm not going to let Dr. Webb kill hundreds of innocent people to complete whatever he started 20 years ago. Agent Martinez nodded slowly. Then, we'll set up the meeting and prepare for whatever Webb is planning. But Mr. Calderon, I want you to understand that this operation will require everything you know about aircraft systems and more courage than any technical manual can teach. As the command center prepared for the next phase of the investigation, Noah called Elena to arrange protective custody for Mateo. The conversation was brief and emotional. Elena understanding immediately that her ex-husband was pursuing something dangerous but necessary, something that connected to the grief and determination that had shaped their son's entire life. Be careful, she said before hanging up. Mateo needs his father to come home. I will, Noah promised, and when this is over, maybe we can finally tell him the truth about why his grandfather died. Outside the conference room, snow continued to fall on the Colorado landscape, covering the airport in a pristine layer of white that made the complex machinery of aviation look deceptively peaceful. Tomorrow, Noah would meet with a terrorist who had killed his father and threatened thousands of innocent passengers. The technical challenges he'd mastered over the past week would be tested in a confrontation that would determine not just Mountain Air's future, but the safety of the entire aviation industry. The hand-drawn airplane schematic seemed to pulse with childish optimism and adult responsibility. Soon Noah would discover whether his expertise was sufficient to protect the dreams that drawing represented, or whether Dr. Webb's conspiracy would shatter those dreams forever. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at Denver International Airport precisely on schedule, carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to controlling complex systems and the people who operated them. Noah watched from the FBI surveillance station as Webb made his way through the Terminala man in his early 60s with silver hair and expensive clothes that suggested success in the specialized world of aviation technology. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Mountain Air's executive conference room, which had been equipped with recording devices and monitored by federal agents positioned throughout the airport. Noah wore a nearly invisible wire and carried a modified tablet that would allow him to demonstrate technical concepts while covertly transmitting information to the FBI command center. "Remember," Agent Martinez said through his earpiece, "your objective is to get Webb to reveal his plans for the transglobal attack. Let him think you're impressed by his technical sophistication and potentially willing to collaborate." Noah nodded, feeling the familiar weight of his father's challenge coin pressed against his chest. The airline's master control system terminal glowed quietly in the adjacent room, the same type of system that Webb had been penetrating for years to test his sabotage techniques. Victoria introduced Noah to Webb with carefully scripted words that portrayed him as a talented technician who had recently discovered vulnerabilities in aircraft systems. Webb's handshake was firm, his smile practiced, but his eyes held the calculating attention of someone who recognized a potential threat. "Mr. Calderon, I've heard impressive things about your work resolving Mountain Air's technical problems," Webb said, settling into his chair with easy confidence. "Victoria tells me you identified systematic issues that had stumped certified maintenance teams for months." "I got lucky," Noah replied, following the script Agent Martinez had prepared. "I happened to recognize patterns that reminded me of problems I'd seen in military systems." "Ah, yes, your Air Force background. Avionics specialist, if I remember correctly." The fact that Webb had researched Noah's background so thoroughly was both encouraging and alarming. It suggested serious interest in Noah's capabilities, but also implied that Webb viewed him as a potential threat worth investigating. "That's right. I worked primarily on fighter aircraft, but the fundamental system architectures are similar across military and commercial platforms." Webb leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting to one of professional interest. "And you believe those similarities extend to vulnerability patterns as well?" "Absolutely. In fact, I think commercial aviation is more vulnerable than military systems because there's less emphasis on security and more focus on cost efficiency." "An astute observation. Tell me, have you considered how those vulnerabilities might be exploited by someone with malicious intent?" Noah felt his pulse accelerate. Webb was probing to determine how much Noah understood about the sabotage techniques, but the conversation was moving into dangerous territory faster than Agent Martinez had anticipated. "I've thought about it," Noah replied carefully. "The interconnected nature of modern aircraft systems means that compromising one component could create cascade failures across multiple systems." Webb's smile widened. "Precisely. And if someone had access to the software that manages those interconnections, say, through legitimate business relationships with multiple airlines, they could potentially coordinate failures across entire fleets. That would require incredibly sophisticated knowledge and access." "Indeed, but the results would be proportionally significant." Webb pulled out his own tablet and displayed a complex diagram showing airline network architectures. Consider Transglobal Airlines, for example. They operate over 300 flights on New Year's Eve, all managed through centralized computer systems that my company helped design. Noah's chest tightened as Webb openly discussed the target that federal investigators had identified. That's an enormous responsibility. It's also an enormous opportunity. Imagine if someone could demonstrate that those centralized systems were vulnerable to coordinated attack. Airlines would be forced to adopt new security protocols, probably including even more centralized management systems to ensure consistent protection. "You mean someone could create a problem in order to sell the solution?" Webb's expression grew more serious. Mr. Calderon, the aviation industry is remarkably resistant to change. Airlines prefer to minimize costs rather than invest in security improvements, even when those improvements could save thousands of lives. Sometimes dramatic demonstrations are necessary to motivate appropriate action. Through his earpiece, Noah heard Agent Martinez's voice. He's confessing to planned terrorism. Keep him talking about specific details. What kind of dramatic demonstrations? Noah asked. Webb studied him for a long moment, his calculating gaze suggesting internal debate about how much to reveal. Hypothetically, if someone could coordinate system failures across multiple aircraft during peak travel periods, the resulting chaos would force immediate industry-wide security improvements. Hypothetically, that could also kill hundreds of innocent people. Short-term casualties to prevent long-term systemic failures. Webb replied with chilling calm. The aviation industry operates thousands of flights daily with inadequate security. A coordinated demonstration of vulnerability would save far more lives than it cost. Noah felt sick listening to Webb's rationalization of mass murder disguised as public service. When would such a hypothetical demonstration occur? New Year's Eve would be optimal. Maximum passenger load, maximum media attention, maximum impact on industry decision-making. Webb leaned back in his chair, watching Noah's reaction carefully. Of course, implementing such a demonstration would require exceptional technical expertise and someone with intimate knowledge of airline security vulnerabilities. Someone like you? Webb's smile was arctic. Someone like us, potentially. Your analysis of Mountain Air's systems was remarkably sophisticated, Mr. Calderon. With proper guidance, you could help develop security solutions that would protect the entire industry. The offer hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Webb was recruiting Noah to participate in the terrorist attack, believing that Noah's technical skills would be valuable for implementing the sabotage or developing the security systems that would follow. That's an interesting proposition, Noah said, fighting to keep his voice steady. What would such collaboration involve? Access to cutting-edge aviation security research. Opportunities to work on projects that could reshape how airlines protect their passengers. Financial compensation commensurate with the value of your contributions. Webb pulled out a contract that looked professionally prepared, complete with legal language and compensation figures that made Noah's eyes widen. The document was real, suggesting that Webb had been planning this recruitment for some time. "This is a formal offer?" Noah asked. "Contingent on successful completion of a demonstration project. Consider it a test of your technical capabilities and your commitment to improving aviation security." Through his earpiece, Agent Martinez was coordinating with other federal agents. "We have enough for arrests. Move in on my signal." But Noah realized they needed more specific information about the trans-global attack to prevent it effectively. What would the demonstration project involve? Webb's expression grew cautious. Nothing illegal, of course, simply a technical analysis of trans-global's system vulnerabilities, followed by recommendations for security improvements. And if those vulnerabilities were significant enough to warrant immediate action, then appropriate authorities would be notified through proper channels. Noah understood that Webb was speaking in code, describing the terrorist attack in language that could be interpreted as legitimate security research. The FBI recordings would capture Webb's intentions, but they might not provide enough technical detail to prevent the actual implementation. "Dr. Webb, I appreciate the offer, but I need to understand exactly what you're planning before I can commit to participating." Webb's smile faded, replaced by the cold calculation of someone who had recognized a threat. "Mr. Calderon, I think you already understand more than you're admitting." The air in the conference room suddenly felt charged with danger. Webb's demeanor had shifted from recruitment to suspicion, and Noah realized that his questions had revealed too much about federal law enforcement interest in the conspiracy. "I understand that you're offering me an opportunity to use my technical skills to improve aviation security," Noah replied, trying to maintain the pretense of innocent interest. I understand that you're wearing a recording device and working with federal agents to gather evidence about activities you don't fully comprehend. The pretense collapsed like a house of cards. Webb stood slowly, his expression shifting to one of cold fury, tempered by professional calculation. "Agent Martinez, we're blown," Noah said into his microphone. "Move in now." Webb pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. "Too late, Mr. Calderon. The trans-global demonstration has been moved up. It begins in 30 minutes. The FBI tactical team burst through the conference room doors 30 seconds too late. Webb had already sent the activation signal to his sabotage systems, and Transglobal's afternoon flights were beginning to experience the first symptoms of coordinated system failures. Agent Martinez's radio crackled with reports from air traffic control centers across the country as aircraft started showing navigation anomalies, communication dropouts, and flight management system errors. 6 aircraft reporting problems so far, Agent Martinez announced, coordinating federal response from her command center. Transglobal 447 en route to Los Angeles, Transglobal 623 departing Miami, 4 others showing initial symptoms. Webb sat calmly in federal custody, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone whose carefully planned operation was proceeding as intended. "You can arrest me, Agent Martinez, but you can't stop what I've already set in motion. Those aircraft are flying with compromised systems that will fail progressively over the next 2 hours." Noah felt the weight of hundreds of lives pressing against his chest like a physical burden. The official FAA certification document with his signature lay on the conference table, tangible proof that he now had the authority to address aircraft system problems, but also the responsibility for whatever happened next. "How do we stop it?" Agent Martinez demanded. Webb's smile was arctic. "You don't. The sabotage is embedded in the aircraft's core systems and activated by altitude and time triggers. Even if you could identify every affected aircraft, you can't modify their software while they're in flight." "Then we ground the entire transglobal fleet," Inspector Rodriguez said, reaching for her emergency communication device. "Too late for that as well," Webb replied. "The aircraft showing symptoms are already airborne with passengers. If you force them to land immediately with compromised navigation systems, you'll cause exactly the kind of catastrophic failures I've been trying to demonstrate." Noah studied the technical readouts on his tablet, his mind racing through the system architectures he'd analyzed during his investigation of Mountain Air's problems. "Webb, you said the sabotage is triggered by altitude and time parameters. That means it's following a predictable sequence." "Very predictable. Each aircraft will experience progressive system failures designed to overwhelm pilot capability and air traffic control resources. The result will be controlled chaos that demonstrates the vulnerability of current aviation systems." "Controlled chaos that kills innocent people," Victoria said with barely contained rage. Webb's expression remained coldly professional. "Acceptable casualties to prevent larger systemic failures. The aviation industry has ignored security vulnerabilities for decades. Sometimes dramatic demonstrations are necessary to motivate appropriate action." Agent Martinez was coordinating with air traffic control centers, while FBI technical specialists established connections to Transglobal's operations center. "Mr. Calderon, we need options. Can you analyze the sabotage techniques and develop countermeasures?" Noah was already working through the problem, applying everything he'd learned about aircraft systems and Webb's attack methods. "The sabotage has to be implemented through software that's already present on the aircraft. Webb couldn't install hardware modifications on every plane in Transglobal's fleet." "Meaning?" "Meaning the attack is probably using legitimate system functions in illegitimate ways. If I can understand the specific trigger mechanisms, I might be able to develop override procedures that pilots can implement manually." Webb laughed coldly. "Mr. Calderon, you're thinking like an engineer when you should be thinking like a systems architect. I didn't modify individual aircraft. I modified the centralized software that manages fleet-wide operations. Every aircraft receives continuous updates from Transglobal's operations center, including navigation data, weather information, and flight management parameters. The implications hit Noah like a physical blow. You've been poisoning the data streams that all Transglobal aircraft depend on for safe flight operations. Precisely. And because the poisoned data looks legitimate to aircraft systems, the pilots have no way to distinguish between accurate information and malicious inputs. Agent Martinez was receiving increasingly urgent reports from air traffic control. 12 aircraft now showing problems, 2 have declared emergencies and are requesting immediate landing clearance. Noah closed his eyes and visualized the system architecture that Webb had described. Centralized operations meant that all Transglobal aircraft were receiving contaminated data from a single source. But that also meant there was a single point of failure that could be addressed if he could gain access to Transglobal's operations systems. "I need direct access to Transglobal's flight operations center," Noah said. "If I can isolate the contaminated data streams and replace them with clean information, the aircraft should be able to complete their flights safely." "Transglobal's operations center is in Atlanta," Agent Martinez replied. "Even with federal authorization, it would take hours to get you there and provide system access. Then we bring their systems here." Noah was already formulating a plan that would require everything he'd learned about aircraft systems and network architecture. Transglobal's operations center manages aircraft through satellite communication links. If we can replicate those links from here and override the contaminated data streams, we can essentially hijack Webb's attack and turn it into a rescue operation. Webb's expression shifted from satisfaction to concern. "That's impossible. You don't have access to Transglobal's communication protocols or encryption keys." "But you do," Noah replied, understanding the opportunity that Webb's presence provided. "And we have federal authority to compel your cooperation in preventing mass casualties." Agent Martinez understood immediately. "Dr. Webb, you have 2 choices. Provide the technical information needed to stop your attack, or face federal terrorism charges that will put you in prison for the rest of your life." "I'll face those charges regardless," Webb pointed out. "Why would I help you prevent the demonstration that I've spent years planning?" Noah looked at the FAA certification document bearing his signature and felt his father's challenge coin pressing against his chest. "Because if those aircraft crash, you'll be responsible for mass murder, not a security demonstration. And because even terrorists sometimes have limits on how many innocent people they're willing to kill." For the first time since his arrest, Webb's professional composure cracked slightly. "You don't understand the stakes involved. The aviation industry's security vulnerabilities represent a threat to national security that far exceeds the casualties from a single demonstration." "Then help us fix those vulnerabilities without killing passengers," Victoria said. "Provide the information Noah needs to stop the attack, and we'll work with you to address the systemic problems you've identified." Webb was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options while Agent Martinez coordinated increasingly urgent federal response efforts. "How many aircraft are affected now?" 18 and climbing, Agent Martinez replied. "If this continues, we could be looking at multiple catastrophic failures within the next hour." Webb's calculation was visible on his face, the conflict between his commitment to demonstrating aviation vulnerabilities and his unwillingness to be responsible for hundreds of deaths. "Mr. Calderon, if I provide the access codes and technical specifications, can you actually implement countermeasures quickly enough to prevent crashes?" "I can try, but I'll need complete cooperation and accurate information." Webb nodded slowly. "Agent Martinez, I want immunity from terrorism charges in exchange for my cooperation in preventing casualties." "Absolutely not, but I can recommend consideration for cooperation during sentencing." "Then you'd better hope Mr. Calderon is as good as he thinks he is." For the next hour, Noah worked with intensity that pushed his technical skills to their absolute limits. Using Webb's access codes and system specifications, He established connections to Transglobal's operations center and began the complex process of identifying and replacing contaminated data streams while the affected aircraft continued flying with progressively failing systems. The work required simultaneous analysis of multiple aircraft systems, real-time coordination with pilots and air traffic controllers, and the kind of intuitive understanding of aviation technology that Noah had inherited from his father and developed through years of hands-on experience. Transglobal 447 is reporting navigation system failure, Agent Martinez announced. They're flying manually with limited instrument guidance. I've isolated their data stream, Noah replied, his fingers moving rapidly across multiple keyboards and tablets. Uploading clean navigation data now. Transglobal 623 has lost communication with air traffic control. Switching their communication protocols to backup frequencies, they should be back online in 30 seconds. Aircraft by aircraft, system by system, Noah worked to counter web sabotage while hundreds of passengers flew unknowingly through the most sophisticated terrorist attack in aviation history. The technical challenges were immense, but the human stakes drove him to find solutions that no training manual had ever contemplated. By 6 p.m., all 18 affected aircraft had landed safely at their destinations or alternate airports, their passengers unaware that they had survived an attack that could have killed thousands. Webb's demonstration had been neutralized, but the broader implications of his conspiracy would reshape aviation security for decades to come. As Noah finally leaned back in his chair, exhausted but successful, Agent Martinez approached with news that would complete his transformation from baggage handler to aviation security expert. Mr. Calderon, the FAA wants to discuss a permanent position coordinating cybersecurity for the aviation industry. Interested? Noah looked at the certification document bearing his signature and felt his father's legacy settling around him like a mantle. Very interested. But first, I need to call my son and tell him that his grandfather would be proud. 3 months later, Noah stood in the executive wing of Mountain Air's headquarters, studying the view from his new office window as aircraft moved through their carefully choreographed dance of departure and arrival. His official employee ID badge identified him as Chief Technical Officer, but the title felt less important than the knowledge that every aircraft he could see was flying with security protocols he'd helped design. The transformation had been remarkably swift. Within weeks of preventing Webb's terrorist attack, Noah found himself at the center of a federal initiative to modernize aviation cybersecurity. The FAA had fast-tracked his certifications, the Department of Homeland Security had recruited him as a consultant, and multiple airlines were implementing security improvements based on his analysis of system vulnerabilities. But the most significant change was personal. For the first time in 12 years, Noah woke up each morning eager to tackle challenges that made full use of his technical abilities while serving a purpose larger than individual advancement. "Dad, are you ready?" Mateo appeared in the office doorway, wearing the kind of smile that had become frequent since Noah's career transformation. At 11 years old, the boy had gained confidence and pride that came from seeing his father recognized for talents that had long been hidden. "Ready for what?" Noah asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Mom's here for the ceremony." Elena stood in the reception area, wearing a dress that Noah hadn't seen since their wedding day, her expression reflecting a mixture of pride and vindication that spoke to years of believing in potential that Noah had nearly abandoned. She greeted him with a warmth that had been absent from their relationship for the better part of a decade. "Congratulations," she said simply. "I always knew you'd find your way back to this." The ceremony was being held in Mountain Air's main hangar, where a small crowd had gathered to witness Noah's formal recognition by the Aviation Security Foundation for his role in preventing the Transglobal attack. Inspector Rodriguez was present, along with Agent Martinez, Victoria Hale, and Richard Banning, who had been cleared of all suspicions and promoted to Director of Aviation Security. But the most meaningful presence was the empty chair in the front row, marked with a small placard bearing Miguel Calderon's name and military rank. Noah's father couldn't witness his son's achievement, but his influence was evident in every aspect of Noah's approach to aviation, security, and technical problem-solving. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Foundation's director announced, "we gather today to recognize extraordinary service in protecting aviation safety and preventing terrorist attacks on the national transportation infrastructure." As Noah walked to the podium to accept the award, he felt his father's challenge coin pressing against his chest with familiar weight. But the sensation was different now, not the burden of unfulfilled potential, but the satisfaction of abilities finally directed toward their intended purpose. "This recognition belongs to everyone who contributed to identifying and stopping Dr. Webb's conspiracy," Noah said, addressing the small audience. "But I want to particularly acknowledge Lieutenant Colonel Miguel Calderon, whose investigation 20 years ago provided the foundation for understanding how aviation systems could be compromised by those with malicious intent." Noah pulled the challenge coin from his pocket and held it up for the audience to see. "My father taught me that understanding machines means understanding their language, and not just the official specifications, but the subtle patterns that reveal their true condition. Today, that lesson helps protect thousands of passengers who will never know how close they came to being victims of sophisticated terrorism." After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and equipment was packed away, Noah found himself alone in the hangar with Mateo. The boy was studying an aircraft engine with the focused attention he'd inherited from his father, asking questions about turbofan mechanics and fuel injection systems. "Will you teach me about airplanes?" Mateo asked. "Like Grandpa taught you?" Noah smiled, remembering afternoons spent in Miguel's garage, learning to diagnose problems by sound and feel rather than by manuals. "I'd like that. But first, let me tell you about your grandfather's real job." They sat on folding chairs beside the aircraft, and Noah began the story he'd never been able to share before: Miguel's work as a test pilot, his investigation of aviation security vulnerabilities, and his death in service of protecting other aviators from system failures that could have killed hundreds of people. "He was a hero," Mateo said when the story was complete. "He was a man who used his abilities to protect people who couldn't protect themselves," Noah replied. "That's what heroes do. They serve purposes larger than their own advancement." "Is that what you're doing now?" Noah looked around the hangar at the complex machinery that represented humanity's conquest of gravity and distance. "I'm trying to follow his example. Use what I know to keep people safe, solve problems that matter, and maybe inspire the next generation to do the same." Mateo was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of family legacy and personal responsibility. "Will you teach me to be like him?" "I'll teach you to be like yourself," Noah replied, "but with the same commitment to using your talents in service of something bigger than personal achievement." As they prepared to leave the hangar, Victoria approached with news that would shape the next phase of Noah's career. "The FAA wants to establish a new aviation cybersecurity division. They're offering you the position of director, reporting directly to the administrator. That's a significant responsibility. It's also an opportunity to prevent future attacks, like Webb's conspiracy. Your analysis revealed vulnerabilities that affect the entire industry. Someone needs to coordinate systematic improvements across all airlines." Noah looked at his new employee ID badge, thinking about the journey from baggage handler to chief technical officer to potential federal executive. What would it involve? Oversight of cybersecurity protocols for all commercial aviation operations. Development of new standards for system integration and vulnerability assessment. Coordination with law enforcement agencies on aviation terrorism prevention. And travel requirements? Victoria smiled, understanding the concern. Primarily based in Denver, with occasional trips to Washington for congressional briefings and industry conferences. Nothing that would disrupt your family life. Noah felt the challenge coin press against his chest one final time, carrying the accumulated weight of his father's sacrifice and his own journey from hidden expertise to recognized achievement. "I'm interested. When would it start?" "July 1st. 3 months to wrap up your responsibilities here and prepare for the transition. As Noah drove home with Mateo that evening, the familiar landscape of Denver stretched before them under an early spring sky that promised longer days and warmer weather. The boy chatted about the ceremony and the aircraft they'd examined, his enthusiasm reflecting the confidence that came from understanding his place in a larger story of service and sacrifice. "Dad," Mateo said as they pulled into their driveway, "I'm proud of you." The words hit Noah with unexpected emotion. For 12 years, he'd measured his success as a father by Mateo's happiness and security, but he'd never considered whether the boy might be proud of his achievements. The possibility that his son could respect him not just as a provider, but as a professional felt like a gift he hadn't expected. "I'm proud of you too, Mijo, for being patient with all the changes, for supporting me when things were uncertain, and for reminding me that some things are more important than playing it safe." That night, as Noah helped Mateo with homework that now included aviation science projects inspired by their shared interest in flight, he reflected on the distance he'd traveled from the baggage handler who'd watched aircraft with hidden longing to the cybersecurity expert who was helping protect aviation's future. The challenge coin sat on his dresser beside Mateo's hand-drawn airplane schematic, symbols of past sacrifice and future possibility that would continue guiding his choices in the years to come. Outside his window, aircraft moved through the night sky with lights that looked like moving stars, carrying passengers who trusted their safety to systems that Noah now helped protect. Sometimes the people who've sacrificed the most are indeed the ones with the most to give. But giving requires the courage to risk everything safe and predictable for the chance to serve something larger than personal security. Noah had finally found that courage, and in finding it, had discovered that the most grounded people are often the ones who help everyone else soar. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Sometimes our greatest shame becomes the doorway to our greatest blessing. In the frontier town of Cold Mercy, Preacher Mercer hands his pregnant daughter over to a giant rancher named Cade Rawlins. Everyone thinks it's punishment. Everyone thinks she'll suffer. But Cade does something nobody expects. He treats her with kindness. He gives her safety. He sees her worth when nobody else will. What happens when the man everyone fears becomes the only person who truly loves her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cold Mercy's dusty main street, but there was nothing warm about the light that filtered through the grimy windows of the general store. Mrs. Abernathy pressed her thin lips together as she watched Lila Jane Mercer walk past, her condition now impossible to hide beneath the loose-fitting dress that had once belonged to her mother. "Shameful," she whispered to her husband, loud enough for half the store to hear. "That poor preacher, having to bear such disgrace from his own flesh and blood." Lila kept her chin up as she passed, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. At 19, she had learned to navigate the cruel currents of small-town judgment, but these past months had tested even her strongest reserves. The weight in her belly had grown heavier with each passing week, and with it, the weight of her father's disappointment. Cold Mercy, Montana Territory, had earned its name honestly. Carved from unforgiving wilderness in 1867, the town clung to survival through sheer stubbornness and the kind of moral rigidity that could freeze a man's soul even in summer. The main street stretched barely 4 blocks, lined with weathered storefronts that had seen better days before most folks could remember. At one end stood the Methodist church, its white steeple rising like an accusing finger toward heaven. At the other, the saloon squatted like a toad, drawing the kind of men the good ladies of Cold Mercy pretended not to notice. Between these two poles of salvation and sin, the townspeople lived their careful lives, always mindful of who was watching and what they might say. In a place where winter could kill you, and neighbors were your only lifeline, reputation mattered more than money. A good name could get you credit at the store, help when your roof leaked, or a place by the fire when the wolves came calling. A bad name could leave you dead in a ditch with nobody to mourn your passing. Lila had grown up understanding this delicate balance, raised in the shadow of her father's pulpit, where every word mattered and every action carried the weight of divine judgment. Reverend Isaiah Mercer had built his reputation on moral certitude and righteous fire, delivering sermons that could make grown men weep for their sins and wives examine their own hearts for hidden transgressions. He was a tall man, with silver threading through his dark beard, hands that could thunder against the lectern or comfort the grieving with equal conviction. But those same hands had trembled when Dr. Morrison confirmed what Lila herself had known for weeks. Those same hands had clenched into fists when she refused to name the father, protecting a man who had already fled town without so much as a farewell note. "You have brought shame upon this house," he had said that terrible evening 3 months ago, his voice hollow as a tomb. "Shame upon my ministry, shame upon your mother's memory." The mention of her mother had cut deepest of all. Sarah Beth Mercer had died when Lila was 12, carried off by consumption that no amount of prayer or medicine could touch. She had been the gentle heart of their home, the one who balanced Isaiah's righteousness with tenderness, who read stories by lamplight and pressed wildflowers between the pages of her worn leather Bible. That Bible now sat on Lila's nightstand, its pages yellow with age and marked with her mother's careful notations in the margins. Lila could still remember her mother's voice, soft as summer rain. "Love is patient, my darling. Love is kind. It keeps no record of wrongs." But her father seemed to have forgotten those words, along with so many others that spoke of forgiveness and redemption. The pregnancy had not been born of love, though Lila had thought it might be at the time. Thomas Whitmore had been everything a young woman might dream of in a frontier town, handsome, charming, full of promises about the life they would build together. He had courted her properly for 6 months, attending church services and asking her father's permission to walk her home on Sunday evenings. He spoke of marriage, of a small ceremony in the spring, of children who would grow up knowing both their parents' love. But when autumn came and her monthly courses did not, Thomas had proven to be made of lesser stuff than his fine words suggested. The very night she told him about the child, he packed his belongings and caught the next stage out of town, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note claiming urgent business in Denver. That had been 7 months ago, and Denver might as well have been the moon for all the chance she had of finding him. Now, as winter loosened its grip on the mountain valleys and spring struggled to assert itself, Lila faced a future as uncertain as the weather. Her father's congregation whispered behind their hands about the preacher's fallen daughter. The ladies of the church auxiliary had stopped inviting her to their quilting circles. Even her oldest friend, Mary Catherine, now crossed the street rather than speak to her in public. The isolation might have broken a weaker spirit, but Lila had inherited more than her mother's Bible. She had her father's backbone, even if she lacked his capacity for cold judgment. She had learned to find comfort in small things, the way morning light fell across her bedroom floor, the satisfaction of a well-tended garden, the movement of life within her womb that reminded her she was not entirely alone. Still, the loneliness cut deep, especially in the long hours after dark, when her father locked himself in his study to prepare sermons about sin and redemption that seemed directed more at his congregation than at his own heart. He had grown distant since her condition became known, speaking to her only when necessary, and then with the formal politeness he might show a stranger seeking charity. The house that had once rung with laughter and heated discussions about Scripture now felt like a tomb. Meals passed in silence, broken only by the clink of silverware against china. Evening prayers had dwindled to perfunctory mutterings that carried no warmth, no hope, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting across from him had once been the apple of his eye. It was in this atmosphere of cold disappointment that Lila first heard the name Cade Rawlins spoken in connection with her future. She had been returning from the mercantile, her arms full of supplies for the evening meal, when she caught fragments of conversation drifting from her father's study. "Practical solution to your problem, Reverend," came a voice she recognized as belonging to Mayor Hutchins. Man like that, He's used to taking care of strays. I will not have my daughter treated as livestock, her father replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Now, Isaiah, you know Cade's got a good reputation for treating his animals fair. Never heard tell of him being cruel to anything under his care. And Lord knows the man could use some company out there on that spread of his. Lila pressed herself against the hallway wall. Packages clutched to her chest, straining to hear more. Cade Rawlins was a name everyone in Cold Mercy knew, though few could claim to know the man himself. He owned a substantial ranch 15 miles north of town, running cattle and horses on land that stretched from the valley floor to the tree line. Folks said he was a veteran of the war between the states, that he had seen things that left him preferring the company of animals to people. He came to town perhaps once a month for supplies, a giant of a man who moved with surprising quiet for his size. Children stared at him from behind their mothers' skirts, and grown men stepped aside when he walked past. Not from fear, exactly, but from the kind of respect reserved for forces of nature, thunderstorms, avalanches, and men who carried their grief like boulders on their shoulders. He's a good Christian man, Mayor Hutchins continued, pays his bills, keeps to himself, never caused trouble for anyone, and he's got that big house sitting empty except for himself. What you're suggesting is barbaric, her father said, but again, there was that telltale hesitation that spoke of a man grasping for solutions to an impossible problem. What I'm suggesting is practical. The girl needs somewhere to go, and you need your reputation intact. Cade needs, well, Lord knows what Cade needs, but he's got the space and the means to provide for her. Might work out better than you think. Lila had heard enough. She crept back to the kitchen and set about preparing dinner with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The conversation continued in the study for another hour, voices rising and falling in the rhythm of negotiation. By the time her father called her to set the table, she could see in his eyes that some decision had been reached. But it would be 3 more days before he found the courage to tell her what that decision was. 3 days during which the weight of unspoken words hung over their house like smoke from a distant fire. 3 days during which Lila watched her father wrestle with his conscience and saw that conscience lose the battle, piece by piece, to his pride and his fear of what the town might say if he kept her under his roof much longer. When he finally spoke the words that would change her life forever, they would come not as a father's love seeking the best for his child, but as a preacher's judgment, seeking the preservation of his own salvation. And Lila would learn that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in the language of necessity, delivered by those who claim to love us most. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning, when the March wind carried the promise of spring, but still held winter's bite. Lila was hanging laundry behind the house, her movements careful and deliberate, as her pregnancy had grown more pronounced with each passing week. The sheets snapped like flags of surrender in the gusting air, and she paused to press a hand to her lower back, where a persistent ache had settled. Lila Jane. Her father's voice cut through the morning stillness with the same authority he used to call his congregation to repentance. Come inside. We need to talk. She knew from his tone that the time for avoiding difficult conversations had passed. The way he stood in the doorway, his shoulders set, and his mouth drawn into a hard line, told her that whatever decision had been brewing in his study these past days was about to be delivered, like a final judgment. Inside the parlor, 2 men waited beside her father. Mayor Hutchins sat in the good chair, his hat balanced on his knees, and his face wearing the careful neutrality of a man conducting unpleasant business. The other man she recognized, but had never formally met Cade Rawlins himself, standing near the window, with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on something far beyond the glass. He was even larger than she remembered from her glimpses of him in town, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that stretched the seams of his worn work shirt. His hair was dark brown, touched with grey at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who spent his days under the open sky. But it was his hands that drew her attention, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, yet somehow gentle in the way he held his hat, as if he understood that even inanimate objects deserved careful treatment. "Sit down, daughter." Her father's voice had taken on the formal cadence he used for serious church business. "Mr. Rawlins and I have reached an understanding about your situation." Lila lowered herself into the chair across from Mayor Hutchins, her heart beginning to race as the full implications of what was happening became clear. "My situation? Your condition has become a source of considerable difficulty for this household," her father continued, pacing behind his chair like a prosecutor before a jury. "As a man of God, I have a responsibility to my congregation, to this community, and to the reputation of the church itself. Your presence here, in your current state, undermines my ability to minister effectively to those who look to me for moral guidance." The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage while maintaining the veneer of righteousness. "Father, I have prayed about this extensively," he cut her off, his voice growing stronger, as if drawing power from the familiar rhythms of moral certitude. "And I believe the Lord has provided a solution that serves everyone's best interests. Mr. Rawlins has graciously agreed to take responsibility for you until such time as your situation resolves itself." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Lila stared at her father, waiting for him to explain that this was some elaborate joke, that the man who had raised her and taught her about God's love would never actually sell his own daughter like a piece of unwanted furniture. But his eyes held no warmth, no regret, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting before him had ever been anything more than an inconvenient burden to be disposed of. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "You can't just give me away." "I can and I will," her father replied with the finality of scripture. "Mr. Rawlins has agreed to provide for your needs until the child is born. After that, arrangements can be made for its care and your future." Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Lila, this is really for the best. Mr. Rawlins has a fine spread up north, plenty of room, and he's a God-fearing man who'll see you're treated proper." For the first time since entering the room, Cade Rawlins spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Begging your pardon, Mayor, but I think the lady should hear this from me direct." He turned from the window to face her, and Lila was startled by the kindness she saw in his dark eyes. They were the color of rich earth after rain, and they held none of the judgment or calculation she had grown accustomed to seeing in the faces around town. "Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice was gentle despite its depth, "I want you to know that this arrangement, if you agree to it, will be conducted with all the respect and propriety you deserve. You'll have your own room in the main house, your own space to do as you please. I won't ask anything of you except to let me provide for your needs until you decide what you want to do next." "And if I refuse?" Lila asked, though she already knew the answer from the set of her father's jaw. "Then you're welcome to seek shelter wherever you can find it," her father said coldly. "But you will not do so under my roof or with my name to protect you." The cruelty of it took her breath away. In that moment, she saw her father clearly, for perhaps the first Timano, as the righteous man of God she had always believed him to be, but as a weak man whose pride mattered more than his daughter's welfare, whose reputation meant more than the child he had raised and claimed to love. Mayor Hutchins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There are papers to be signed, of course, legal documents transferring responsibility and such. Nothing permanent, you understand, just until the situation stabilizes." "Papers," Lila repeated numbly. The words seemed to echo in the small room, reducing her entire existence to lines of ink on parchment. "It's all perfectly legal and proper," Mayor Hutchins assured her, producing a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Mr. Rawlins assumes responsibility for your care and maintenance, and in return receives certain considerations regarding your welfare and that of the child." Cade Rawlins stepped forward, his expression darkening. "Now hold on there, Mayor. We never discussed any considerations about the child. That's not what I agreed to." "Well, naturally, if you're providing for the mother, there are certain expectations." "The only expectation Cade interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made both other men pause. "Is that I provide a safe place for this young lady to have her baby in peace. Nothing more, nothing less." He looked directly at Lila then, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in months: genuine concern for her well-being, rather than worry about what her presence might cost him. "Miss Mercer," he said carefully, "if you're willing to come stay at my place, I promise you'll be treated with respect. You'll have privacy, comfort, and safety for as long as you need it. And when you're ready to decide what comes next, that'll be your choice to make, not mine or anyone else's." The room fell silent again, as everyone waited for her response. Lila looked around at the faces surrounding her father's cold determination, Mayor Hutchins' bureaucratic discomfort, and Cade Rawlins' unexpected compassion. The choice, such as it was, seemed absurdly simple. She could stay and continue to endure her father's contempt and the town's whispered condemnation, growing heavier and more isolated with each passing day until the birth itself became just another source of shame to be hidden away. Or she could take a chance on the kindness she saw in a stranger's eyes, trusting that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. "I'll need to pack my things," she said quietly. Her father nodded once, a sharp movement that spoke of business concluded and burdens lifted. "Mr. Rawlins will return for you tomorrow morning. Be ready." As the men filed out of the parlor to complete their arrangements, Lila remained in her chair, one hand resting on her belly where her child stirred restlessly, as if sensing the monumental change that was coming. Through the window, she could see Cade Rawlins speaking quietly with her father near the front gate, and she caught fragments of his words carried on the wind. "I'll build her a room with windows," he was saying, and something in his tone suggested this was both a promise and a warning. "She'll want to see the sky." For the first time in months, Lila felt something stirring in her chest that might have been hope. The journey to Cade Rawlins' ranch took most of the morning, winding through mountain passes where snow still clung to the shadows and early wildflowers dotted the meadows with splashes of color. Lila sat beside him on the wagon seat, her few possessions secured in the back alongside supplies from town, and tried not to think about how thoroughly her life had changed in the space of 24 hours. Cade drove with the easy competence of a man comfortable with horses and distance, speaking little but pointing out landmarks along the way: a creek where elk came to drink, a stand of aspen trees that turned gold in autumn, a rocky outcropping where eagles nested each spring. His voice when he spoke was gentle, free of the judgment she had grown accustomed to hearing in town. "That's my north pasture," he said as they crested a hill, and the ranch spread out below them. "Cattle winter there mostly, though I move them up higher come summer." Lila gazed down at the valley with something approaching wonder. The ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek that sparkled in the morning sun. It was larger than she had expected, built of logs and stone, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the light like welcoming eyes. Outbuildings dotted the property: a barn, corrals, a chicken coop, and what looked like a workshop, all connected by well-worn paths and rail fences that spoke of careful maintenance and pride in the work. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. Cade glanced at her with surprise, as if he had expected criticism rather than appreciation. "Gets lonely sometimes, but it's good land. Been in my family since before the war." As they drew closer to the house, Lila could see more details that spoke to the character of the man beside her. The porch railings were carved with intricate patterns that suggested long winter evenings spent with careful hands and sharp tools. Flower boxes beneath the windows held the stubble of last year's plantings, waiting for someone to coax new life from their soil. A vegetable garden plot had been prepared for spring planting, the soil dark and rich and ready. "I've got the room ready for you," Cade said as he helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle and brief in their contact. "It's got windows facing east and south, so you'll get good light most of the day." The interior of the house was as carefully maintained as the exterior, with wide plank floors polished smooth by years of use and furniture that spoke of quality rather than showiness. Quilts hung over chairbacks, and the stone fireplace showed signs of regular use. Books lined shelves built into the walls, and Lila caught titles that suggested a man of broader interests than his quiet demeanor might indicate. "Kitchen's through there," Cade said, setting her bags down near the staircase. "You're welcome to anything you need. I usually eat simple meat, bread, whatever vegetables I can manage from the garden, but if you know how to cook different, I'd be grateful for the change." He led her upstairs to a room that took her breath away. It was larger than her bedroom at home, with windows on 2 walls that looked out over the valley and mountains beyond. A quilt covered the bed, and someone, Cade, she realized, had placed wildflowers in a mason jar on the dresser, their yellow petals bright against the dark wood. But it was the piece of furniture in the corner that made her eyes fill with unexpected tears. A wooden cradle sat there, clearly handmade, with sides carved in the same intricate patterns she had noticed on the porch railings. The wood was smooth as silk, sanded and oiled until it gleamed, and lined with soft fabric that looked suspiciously like it had been cut from one of the quilts downstairs. "You made this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cade shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his big hands twisting the brim of his hat. "Figured you might need it come time. It's nothing fancy, but it's solid. Should last." Lila reached out to touch the smooth wood, overwhelmed by this evidence of thoughtfulness from a man who barely knew her. In town, people crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her condition. Her own father spoke of her pregnancy as a problem to be solved, rather than a life to be welcomed. But this stranger had spent hours crafting something beautiful for a child he would never claim, simply because he saw a need and chose to fill it. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she said, and meant every word. "I'll leave you to get settled," Cade said, backing toward the door with the awkward haste of a man unaccustomed to emotional displays. "Supper's usually around 6, but don't feel obliged. You can eat when you want, sleep when you want. This is your home now, for as long as you need it." After he left, Lila sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that was somehow already more welcoming than the house where she had spent 19 years. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming her face and highlighting dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. For the first time in months, she felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of fear and shame that had grown so familiar. She had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. That evening, she ventured downstairs to find Cade in the kitchen, wrestling with what appeared to be an ambitious attempt at biscuits. Flour dusted his shirt and the counter, and the expression on his face suggested that cooking was not among his natural talents. "Might I help?" she offered, and at his grateful nod, she took over the preparation while he set the table with the careful precision of a man determined to do things properly. They ate by lamplight, speaking little but comfortably, like old friends who didn't need words to fill every silence. Cade asked about her preferences for breakfast, whether she liked her coffee strong or weak, if there were foods that disagreed with her condition. Simple questions, practical concerns, but underneath them lay a consideration for her welfare that warmed her more than the fire crackling in the hearth. "Thank you," she said as they finished the meal, "for all of this, for the room, the cradle, for treating me like a person deserving of respect." Cade finished quietly. "That's not something you should have to thank anyone for, Miss Mercer. That's just how things ought to be." That night, Lila lay in her new bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling around hearth, creak of wood expanding and contracting with the temperature, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the mountain sky like scattered diamonds, and for the first time since learning about her pregnancy, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held something more than shame and sorrow. In the room below, she could hear Cade moving around the kitchen, banking the fire, and securing the house for the night. The sounds were comforting rather than intrusive, the careful actions of a man taking responsibility for those under his protection. When all was quiet, she placed her hand on her belly, where her child rested, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for whatever providence had led her to this place, to this man who saw her worth when she had almost forgotten it herself. Spring arrived at the ranch with gentle insistence, coaxing green shoots from the dark earth and filling the air with the promise of renewal. Lila had been there 2 weeks, and each day brought small revelations about the man who had taken her in and the life they were cautiously building together. She had discovered that Cade rose before dawn, moving through the house with surprising quiet for such a large man, always careful not to wake her as he prepared for the day's work. By the time she made her way downstairs, coffee would be waiting on the stove and eggs gathering in a basket by the back door, evidence of his morning rounds through the chicken coop. "You don't have to cook for me," he had said that first week, but she could see the pleasure in his eyes when she insisted on taking over the kitchen duties. It gave her purpose, a way to contribute to the household that didn't involve charity or pity. This morning, like the others, she found him in the vegetable garden plot behind the house, turning soil that had been waiting all winter for attention. His shirt was already damp with perspiration despite the cool air, and dirt clung to his hands and forearms as he worked the stubborn earth into neat rows. "What will you plant?" she asked, settling carefully on the porch steps where she could watch him work. "The usual: potatoes, beans, carrots, onions, whatever keeps well through winter." He paused in his digging to look at her. "You have thoughts on the matter?" The question surprised her. Thomas had never asked her opinion about anything more substantial than what dress to wear to church. Her father made pronouncements rather than seeking input, but Cade seemed genuinely interested in her answer. "My mother used to grow herbs," she said, remembering Sarah Beth's small garden behind the parsonage. "Sage and thyme, parsley and dill. She said they made even simple food taste like celebration." "Herbs would be good," Cade agreed, resuming his work. "Haven't had much call for them, cooking just for myself, but I reckon that's about to change." Later that morning, Lila found a packet of wildflower seeds in the supply closet, clearly forgotten from some previous spring's ambitious plans. Without asking permission, she claimed a corner of the garden plot and scattered the seeds with the same faith her mother had shown in her herb garden trust, that something beautiful could grow from the simplest beginnings. As the days lengthened and warmed, she found herself venturing farther from the house, exploring the ranch with the careful steps of someone learning to trust her feet again. Cade had introduced her to the animals with the formal courtesy he might use for distinguished guests. There was Duchess, an ancient milk cow with wise eyes and a gentle disposition. The horses, Thunder, Belle, and Smoku, came to the fence when she approached, curious about this new presence in their domain. "They're good judges of character," Cade had said, watching Belle nuzzle Lila's palm in search of treats. "Animals know things about people that people sometimes miss about themselves." The chickens proved to be the most entertaining, a collection of hens with distinct personalities, and a rooster named Napoleon who took his responsibilities seriously. Lila discovered that gathering eggs could be either a peaceful meditation or a military operation, depending on Napoleon's mood and whether he deemed her worthy of access to his ladies. "He's protective," Cade explained after Napoleon had chased her from the coop in a flurry of indignant squawking. "Can't fault him for that." In the evenings, after the animals were tended and the day's work complete, they fell into a comfortable routine of shared meals and quiet conversation. Cade proved to be a better listener than talker, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged her to speak about things she had kept locked away for months. "You miss teaching," he observed one evening, as she described her work at the small school in Cold Mercy, before her condition made it impossible to continue. "I miss the children," she said, surprised by how much the admission hurt. "They didn't care about my circumstances. They just wanted to learn their letters and hear stories." "You could teach again," Cade said carefully. "When you're ready. There are always children who need learning, and not all of them are lucky enough to live in towns with proper schools." The possibility had never occurred to her. In her father's house, her pregnancy had felt like an ending the conclusion of all her dreams and aspirations. But here, watching the sun set over the valley while her child stirred restlessly in her womb, she could almost imagine a different kind of future. "Tell me about the war," she said one evening, recognizing in his eyes the same shadows she had seen in other veterans who had passed through Cold Mercy. Cade was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories too heavy for one man to bear alone. "Lost a lot of good men," he said simply. "Came home to find I'd lost my wife too. Consumption took her while I was gone, and nobody thought to write and tell me until it was too late for goodbyes." The pain in his voice made her chest tighten with sympathy. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He stared into the fire for a moment before continuing. "Used to think this place was too quiet, too empty, but quiet's not so bad when it's the right kind of quiet. When it's peaceful instead of just hollow." She understood what he meant. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than judgment. It was the kind of quiet that came from shared understanding, from two people who had both learned that life could disappoint you in ways you never expected, but still surprise you with unexpected grace. "Cade," she said, using his name for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "Why did you agree to take me in? Really?" He looked at her then, his dark eyes serious and honest. "Because nobody deserves to be thrown away like rubbish, especially not when they're carrying life. And because this place needed someone who could see its beauty instead of just its loneliness." That night, as she watched her wildflower seeds beginning to sprout in neat green rows, Lila realized that something was growing inside her too, not just the child she carried, but hope itself, taking root in soil that had seemed barren just weeks before. For the first time since leaving her father's house, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The discovery came by accident on a warm May morning when Lila was helping Cade organize his cluttered desk in search of receipts for the tax assessor. She had been staying at the ranch for 6 weeks, and their easy partnership had extended to household tasks that he had clearly been neglecting for years. "You keep your important papers in the oddest places," she said, pulling a deed from between the pages of a veterinary manual. "How do you ever find anything?" "I mostly don't," Cade admitted, sorting through a stack of correspondence that dated back several years. "Never was much good at the business side of ranching. I just know how to work the land and care for the animals." It was while reaching for a ledger on the highest shelf that her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small wooden box pushed far back behind the books. When she brought it down, Cade's entire body went still, his face draining of color as he recognized what she held. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, seeing his distress. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," he said, though his voice had gone hoarse. "I'd forgotten it was there." The box was made of the same fine wood as her cradle, polished smooth by handling and age. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a military Medaltha bronze star, she realized, recognizing it from illustrations she had seen in newspapers during the war. Beneath it was a small daguerreotype of a young woman with gentle eyes and a smile that spoke of quiet happiness. "Your wife," Lila said softly, not a question, but a statement of understanding. "Mary Elizabeth." Cade's voice was barely above a whisper. She was. She was everything good about this place, everything I was fighting to come home to. Lila studied the photograph, seeing in the woman's face the kind of serene beauty that came from deep contentment rather than mere physical features. This was someone who had been truly loved, truly cherished, and the knowledge of what Cade had lost made her heart ache for him. She would have been a wonderful mother, she said, instinctively understanding that this was at the heart of his grief. She wanted children more than anything, Cade confirmed, taking the photograph with reverent care. "We tried for 3 years before I left for the war. She was so sure that by the time I came home, but the consumption took that dream along with everything else." "Tell me about her," Lila said, settling into the chair across from him. "What was she like?" For a moment she thought he would refuse, but then something in his expression softened, as if he had been waiting years for someone to ask that question. "She laughed at everything," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Used to say that life was too hard to waste time being grim about it. She could find joy in the smallest things, a butterfly in the garden, a good crop of tomatoes, the way morning light fell across our kitchen table." As he spoke, Lila could see Mary Elizabeth taking shape in her mind, a woman who had filled this house with warmth and laughter, who had made Cade believe in possibilities beyond mere survival. No wonder the place had felt hollow to him after her death. No wonder he had retreated into solitude rather than try to rebuild what they had shared. "She sounds wonderful," Lila said, meaning it completely. "She was, and she would have liked you." Cade looked up from the photograph to meet her eyes. "She would have said you had a strong spirit, that you'd survived things that would have broken lesser women. She always could see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house, unusual enough to make them both look toward the window with concern. Visitors were rare at the ranch, and unannounced visitors were virtually unheard of. "Stay here," Cade said, but Lila was already moving toward the window to peer through the curtains. 3 men sat on horseback in the yard, their clothes marking them as townspeople rather than neighboring ranchers. She recognized one of them, Dr. Morrison, who had confirmed her pregnancy what seemed like a lifetime ago. The other 2 were strangers, but their bearing suggested official business of some kind. "Dr. Morrison's here," she said, her stomach clenching with sudden anxiety. "With 2 men I don't recognize." Cade cursed under his breath, carefully placing his wife's photograph back in its box. "Probably the territorial health inspector and a deputy marshal. I was wondering when they'd show up." "What do they want?" "To make sure you're being treated properly. I'd guess. Your father's been getting questions from the church hierarchy about his daughter's sudden disappearance. Had to provide some kind of official explanation." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. "They want to take me back. Not if I have anything to say about it." Cade's voice carried a quiet determination that reminded her of the military bearing she could sometimes glimpse beneath his civilian gentleness. "But they'll want to inspect the arrangements, ask questions, make sure everything's legal and proper." The knock on the front door was firm and official. Cade straightened his shoulders and walked to answer it, every inch the respectable rancher welcoming unexpected guests. Lila heard the murmur of voices, formal introductions, the kind of careful politeness that preceded difficult conversations. "Miss Mercer," Dr. Morrison said as she entered the parlor, his tone professionally neutral. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Dr. Morrison, I'm feeling very well." The health inspector, a thin man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the demeanor of someone who found fault with everything he examined, looked around the room with obvious skepticism. "I am Inspector Hartwell from the Territorial Capital. We've received complaints about the irregular nature of your living arrangements here." "Complaints from whom?" Cade asked, though they all knew the answer. "Concerned citizens who question whether proper moral standards are being maintained," the deputy marshal said. He was younger than the others, with the nervous energy of a man eager to prove his authority. "There are laws about unmarried persons of opposite genders cohabitating, especially when one party is in a delicate condition." "Miss Mercer has her own quarters," Cade said evenly. "She receives proper care and supervision. I fail to see what laws might be violated by Christian charity." "Christian charity is one thing," Inspector Hartwell said, producing a notebook and pencil. "But the appearance of impropriety is quite another. I'll need to examine the living arrangements and speak with Miss Mercer privately to ensure she is here of her own free will." The next hour passed in a blur of questions, inspections, and barely concealed accusations. The men examined her room, questioned her about her daily routine, and asked pointed questions about the nature of her relationship with Cade that made her face burn with embarrassment and anger. Through it all, Cade remained calm and respectful, answering their inquiries with the patience of a man who had nothing to hide. But Lila could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when they implied that he might be taking advantage of her vulnerable situation. "Everything appears to be in order," Dr. Morrison said finally, his tone suggesting that he was not entirely pleased with this conclusion. "Miss Mercer seems to be receiving adequate care." "More than adequate," she said firmly, finding her voice at last. "Mr. Rawlins has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. I am here by choice, and I am grateful for his protection." The words seemed to surprise them, as if they had expected to find a frightened, mistreated woman grateful for rescue. Instead, they found someone who spoke with quiet dignity about her circumstances and clear appreciation for the man who had given her sanctuary. After they left, Lila and Cade sat in the parlor, both drained by the encounter. The medal and photograph still lay on the desk between them, reminders of the conversation that had been interrupted by official scrutiny. "This won't be the end of it," Cade said quietly. "Your father's not going to let this rest. He needs to prove that his decision was righteous, that you're being properly managed." "Then what do we do?" Cade looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shifting in his expression, a decision being made, a line being drawn. "We make sure they have nothing to complain about," he said. "We make this arrangement so respectable, so unquestionably proper, that even your father can't find fault with it." Lila had the distinct feeling that he was talking about something more than just maintaining separate quarters and observing social proprieties. But whatever plan was forming in his mind, she trusted him to handle it with the same careful consideration he had shown her from the very beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, delivered by a rider who wouldn't meet Lila's eyes as he handed over the envelope. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she recognized with a sinking, heart-bold, confident strokes that had once seemed romantic but now felt like a threat. Thomas Whitmore had found her. Lila sat on the porch steps, the unopened letter trembling in her hands as she watched the messenger disappear down the valley road. Her child had grown active in recent weeks, responding to her moods with restless movement that reminded her constantly of the life she carried and the choices that lay ahead. "Bad news?" Cade asked, emerging from the barn where he had been shoeing one of the horses. He took one look at her face and set down his tools, his expression darkening with concern. "It's from Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the father of my child." Cade's entire body went still, the way she had seen him react when a storm was approaching, or when something had spooked the cattle. "What does he want?" "I don't know. I haven't opened it yet." She stared at the envelope, as if it might burst into flames at any moment. "I thought he was gone forever. It's been almost 8 months since he left." "Maybe we should read it together," Cade suggested gently, settling beside her on the steps. "Whatever it says, you don't have to face it alone." With shaking fingers, Lila broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Thomas's handwriting filled a single page, the words as careless and self-serving as the man who had written them. "My dear Lila," she read aloud, her voice growing steadier with anger. "I have recently learned of your situation and current circumstances through mutual acquaintances in Denver. I must say I am disturbed to hear that you have taken up residence with a stranger rather than waiting for my return to properly address our situation." Cade made a sound low in his throat that might have been a growl. "Our situation? The man abandons you and then has the nerve to claim ownership." Lila continued reading, each word stoking the fire of her indignation. "I have concluded my business affairs here and am prepared to return to Cold Mercy to claim what is rightfully mine. I expect you to conduct yourself with appropriate discretion until I arrive to make the necessary arrangements for our marriage and the proper raising of my child." "His child," Cade repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "There's more." Lila's hands were shaking again, but with fury rather than fear. "I trust you will see the wisdom of ending your current inappropriate arrangement immediately. A woman in your condition should not be living in sin with a man who has no legal claim to her welfare. I will arrive by the end of the month to collect you and make proper provision for our family." The letter was signed with Thomas's full name and a flourish that suggested he considered the matter settled by his mere declaration of intent. For several minutes they sat in silence, the weight of Thomas's presumption settling between them like a stone. The morning that had begun with such peaceful promise now felt charged with the threat of upheaval, of having the careful sanctuary they had built together torn apart by a man who had forfeited any right to claim either Lila or her child. "He thinks he can just waltz back here and pick up where he left off," Lila said finally, her voice tight with controlled rage. "As if the past 8 months never happened, as if I've been sitting here like some faithful dog waiting for him to remember I exist. "What do you want to do?" Cade asked, and the question surprised her with its simplicity. Not what she should do, or what was proper, or what others might expect what she wanted. "I want to burn this letter and pretend I never received it," she said honestly. "I want Thomas Whitmore to disappear, back to wherever he came from, and leave us in peace." "Us," Cade repeated softly, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Cade, She stopped, realizing what she had revealed in her moment of emotional honesty. "I didn't mean to presume." "You weren't presuming anything," he said, his dark eyes serious and intent. "These past months, watching you bloom here, watching you find your strength again, it's been like seeing the ranch come back to life. You belong here, Lila. Not because of some legal arrangement or charitable obligation, but because this place needs you the way the earth needs rain." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch could have been. Lila felt her heart racing, not with fear but with a recognition that had been building for weeks, the understanding that what had begun as rescue had grown into something far deeper and more precious. "But Thomas has legal rights," she said, trying to be practical, even as her heart yearned toward the possibility Cade was offering. "He is the father, and unmarried women have few protections under the law. Legal rights can be challenged," Cade said firmly. "A man who abandons a woman when she needs him most, who leaves her to face shame and hardship alone, that's not a father. That's just a man who happened to plant a seed." The fierce protectiveness in his voice reminded her of Napoleon defending his hens, but there was something more here, depth of caring that went beyond mere chivalry or duty. "What are you saying, Cade?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley where their wildflowers had begun to bloom in brilliant patches of color among the green grass. When he spoke, his words were careful, deliberate, weighted with significance. "I'm saying that if you were my wife, legally and properly, Thomas Whitmore would have no claim on you or your child. I'm saying that what we've built here doesn't have to end just because some fool finally remembered his responsibilities." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd consider it," Cade said, turning to face her fully. "Not because you need protection, though I'd be honored to provide it. Not because it would solve our immediate problem, though it would. I'm asking because somewhere, in these past months, watching you plant flowers and teach Napoleon proper manners and turn this house back into a home, I fell in love with you." The words seemed to hang in the morning air like music, beautiful and unexpected and perfect in their simplicity. Lila looked at this man who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself, who was offering not just his name and protection, but his heart. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission feeling like a prayer. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to hope." "Hope's not something to be afraid of," Cade said, reaching for her hands with the gentle reverence she had come to associate with all his gestures toward her. "Not when it's grounded in truth." He leaned forward then, slowly and carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when she instead tilted her face up toward his, he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of patience and deep affection rather than mere passion. "We'll need to act quickly," he said when they broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. "If Thomas is planning to arrive by month's end, we should be married before then. Make it impossible for him to challenge our legal standing." "The preacher in town won't marry us," Cade finished grimly. "Not with your father's opposition and the questions about your condition, but there's a circuit judge who comes through Copper Falls once a month. Judge Harrison, he's a fair man, more concerned with justice than appearances." As they sat together planning their future, Lila felt the last of her fears dissolving like morning mist. Thomas's letter, which had seemed like such a threat just minutes ago, now felt like nothing more than the desperate bluster of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman, but as Lila Rawlins' wife, partner, and beloved companion to a man who had shown her what true love looked like. The journey to Copper Falls took most of the day, winding through mountain passes that Lila had never seen before. She sat beside Cade on the wagon seat, wearing her mother's best dress navy blue with tiny pearl buttons that she had let out as much as possible to accommodate her condition. In her lap she held a small bouquet of wildflowers from their garden, the same varieties she had planted that first hopeful morning at the ranch. Judge Harrison proved to be a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes and the practical manner of someone who had spent his career dealing with the realities of frontier life rather than its idealized version. His temporary courthouse was the back room of the Copper Falls Hotel, where he conducted business with the efficient dignity of a man who understood that legal ceremonies should be meaningful rather than merely formal. "Mr. Rawlins, Miss Mercer," he said, looking up from the papers Cade had presented. "I understand you wish to be married today." "Yes, sir," Cade replied, his hand finding Lila's with gentle reassurance. "We have the license and witnesses." The witnesses were the hotel proprietor and his wife, strangers who had agreed to serve in this capacity with the casual kindness that frontier communities showed to those in need of assistance. They stood quietly in the corner, respectful of the solemnity of the moment. "Miss Mercer," Judge Harrison said, his tone gentle but direct, "are you entering into this marriage of your own free will, without coercion or undue influence?" "I am," Lila said firmly, meaning every word. "And you understand that marriage is a legal contract with responsibilities and obligations that cannot be easily dissolved?" "We do," they answered together. The ceremony itself was simple but dignified, the judge's words carrying the weight of law and tradition without unnecessary elaboration. When Cade slipped a simple gold band onto her finger run he had purchased that morning from the general store, Lila felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman. She was Lila Rawlins, wife and partner to a man who loved her. The ride home was peaceful, filled with the comfortable silence of two people who had just made a momentous decision and found it good. The late afternoon sun painted the valley in shades of gold and green, and their ranch, their home, looked more beautiful than ever as they crested the final hill. But as they drew closer to the house, Lila noticed something that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. 3 horses stood tied to the front porch rail, and smoke rose from the chimney despite the warm weather signs of visitors who had made themselves at home in their absence. "Stay close to me," Cade said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to check the rifle secured beneath the wagon seat. They were still 50 yards from the house when the front door opened and 3 men emerged onto the porch. Thomas Whitmore led the group, looking every inch the successful businessman in his fine clothes and polished boots. Behind him came Mayor Hutchins, his face wearing the careful neutrality of a politician trying to navigate troubled waters. The third man was a stranger well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Lila," Thomas called out as if greeting a beloved friend rather than the woman he had abandoned 8 months earlier. "Thank God you're safe. When I arrived and found you missing, I feared the worst." Cade brought the wagon to a stop in front of the porch, his body radiating the controlled tension of a man preparing for conflict. "Whitmore, I wasn't expecting you for another week. I was able to conclude my business earlier than anticipated," Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on Lila with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I came as soon as I received word about Lila's situation." "Her situation is perfectly respectable," Cade said evenly, helping Lila down from the wagon with careful attention to her condition. "Living in sin with a stranger while carrying my child." Thomas's voice carried the righteous indignation of a man who had convinced himself he was the injured party. "I think not." "Actually," Lila said, finding her voice and her courage, "my situation is that of a properly married woman. Mr. Rawlins and I were wed this afternoon by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls." The silence that followed her announcement was so complete that she could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and finally a rage so pure it made his features ugly. "Impossible," he sputtered. "You can't marry someone else while carrying my child. It's not legal, it's not moral." "It's perfectly legal," the stranger said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am attorney Charles Brennan from Denver. Mr. Whitmore engaged my services to ensure the proper resolution of this matter. However, if what you say is true, Mrs. Rawlins, is it? Then the situation has become considerably more complex." Cade reached into his jacket and produced their marriage certificate, the ink still fresh and the judge's seal clearly visible. "Mrs. Rawlins is my wife in every legal sense. Her previous relationship with Mr. Whitmore, whatever its nature, was never formalized through marriage. He has no legal claim on her whatsoever." Attorney Brennan examined the document with the thoroughness of a man trained to find flaws in legal proceedings. After several minutes, he looked up with obvious frustration. "The marriage appears to be entirely valid. Mr. Whitmore, I'm afraid your position has become untenable." "My position?" Thomas's voice rose to something approaching a shout. "That's my child she's carrying, my blood. You can't tell me I have no rights to my own offspring." "Actually, I can," Brennan said with professional detachment. "Under territorial law, a child born in wedlock is presumed to be the child of the husband, regardless of the biological circumstances. Mrs. Rawlins' child will be legally considered Mr. Rawlins' child from the moment of birth." The implications of this hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had been so confident in his righteousness, so certain that his mere appearance would resolve everything in his favor, that he hadn't considered the possibility that Lila might have moved beyond waiting for his return. "This is outrageous," he declared, turning to Mayor Hutchins as if expecting support. "You can't allow this travesty to stand. The woman was practically given to this man like property. The marriage is clearly a sham, designed to prevent me from claiming what's rightfully mine." "Now see here, young man," Mayor Hutchins said uncomfortably, "the Rawlins marriage may have been sudden, but it appears to be entirely legal. And given your own absence during the lady's time of need, I'm not sure you're in a position to make demands." Lila watched this exchange with growing amazement. For months, she had lived in fear of this confrontation, imagining Thomas as a figure of overwhelming authority who could sweep back into her life and reclaim control. Instead, she saw him for what he really was, selfish man who had expected the world to remain frozen in place while he pursued his own interests. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had found her strength, "you made your choice 8 months ago when you left me to face this alone. I've made mine today. Mr. Rawlins, me husband, has shown me more kindness and respect in 3 months than you managed in 6 months of courtship. But the child will be raised by parents who love and want it." Lila interrupted firmly, "by a father who carved its cradle with his own hands and a mother who will teach it that real love means staying, even when times are difficult." Thomas looked around the group, seeking any ally in his cause, but found only faces that ranged from hostile to merely unsympathetic. Even Attorney Brennan, despite being paid for his services, seemed to recognize the futility of challenging a legal marriage based on moral outrage alone. "This isn't over," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "I'll find a way to challenge this mockery. That child belongs to me." "No," Cade said, speaking for the first time since presenting their marriage certificate. His voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of a man defending his family. "That child belongs to the family that wants it, protects it, and will love it every day of its life. You're not part of that family, Whitmore. You never were." As the 3 men prepared to leave, defeated in their mission but unwilling to acknowledge it gracefully, Lila felt a profound sense of completion. The future she had feared for so many months, a future dominated by shame, obligation, and loveless duty, had been replaced by something infinitely better. She was Mrs. Rawlins now, partner to a man who had proven his love through action rather than words, mother to a child who would grow up knowing security and acceptance rather than shame. And as she watched Thomas Whitmore ride away, disappearing into the gathering twilight like the bad dream he had always been. She knew that sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting, but from choosing a different battlefield entirely. The weeks following Thomas's departure brought an unexpected peace to the ranch, as if the very air had been cleansed of the tension that had hung over them since his letter arrived. Lila settled into her new role as Mrs. Rawlins with a contentment that surprised her in its completeness. The gold band on her finger caught the morning light as she gathered eggs, and she found herself pausing to admire it not for its modest beauty, but for what it represented. She was no longer alone. More than that, she was truly wanted. July brought the full heat of summer to the valley, and with it, the constant activity of a working ranch. Lila had grown large with child, her movements careful but determined as she refused to let her condition render her useless. Cade worried constantly about her overexerting herself, but she had discovered that physical activity helped manage the restless energy that came with the final months of pregnancy. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said one morning as he found her in the garden, weeding between the rows of vegetables despite the early hour heat. "Least of all to me." "I'm not trying to prove anything," she replied, straightening with one hand pressed to her lower back. "I'm trying to be useful. This baby's going to come whether I sit in a chair all day or keep working. I'd rather be productive." The vegetables they had planted together in the spring had flourished beyond either of their expectations. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, beans climbed their poles with eager abundance, and the herb garden had become a fragrant paradise that made even simple meals taste like celebrations. Lila had discovered that she possessed her mother's gift for coaxing life from the earth, and the evidence of that gift surrounded them in green profusion. But it was the wildflower patch that drew her attention most often. The seeds she had scattered that first hopeful morning had grown into a riot of color-purple lupines, yellow coreopsis, red Indian paintbrush, and white yarrow that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds in delightful abundance. Looking at them, she could measure the distance she had traveled from the frightened, shamed woman who had arrived at the ranch 4 months ago. The transformation was not lost on the neighbors either. Word of their marriage had spread through the mountain communities with the speed that news always traveled in sparsely populated areas. Some of the responses had been predictably judgmental, whispered, comments about hasty weddings and questionable circumstances. But others had surprised her with their warmth and acceptance. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose ranch lay 10 miles to the west, had arrived one afternoon with a basket of baby clothes and a matter-of-fact manner that brooked no embarrassment. "Every child needs proper clothing," she had said, unpacking tiny gowns and blankets with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 6 children of her own. "These belong to my youngest, and they're too good to waste." "Mrs. Patterson, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just raise that baby with love and teach it right from wrong. That's all any of us can do." The Hendricks family from the next valley had sent their eldest son with an offer to help with the heavier ranch work as Lila's time drew near. Even crusty old Pete Morrison, who ran cattle on the far side of the mountain, had stopped by to offer his congratulations and share a bottle of whiskey with Cade in celebration of the marriage. "Takes a strong woman to make a go of it out here," he had said, nodding approvingly at Lila's obvious contentment. "And takes a wise man to recognize one when he sees her." But along with the acceptance came other, more troubling developments. Dr. Morrison had stopped by twice in recent weeks, ostensibly to check on Lila's condition, but clearly fishing for information about the circumstances of her marriage. His questions had a pointed quality that suggested someone was encouraging his curiosity. "Everything appears normal," he had said after his most recent examination, "though I confess surprise at how settled you seem, given the unusual circumstances of your situation." "What's unusual about a woman being happy in her marriage?" Lila had asked, her voice carrying an edge that made the doctor step back slightly. "Nothing, of course. Nothing at all. I simply meant, that is, the timing of events." "The timing of events is our business, Dr. Morrison," Cade had interjected with quiet firmness. "I trust you'll respect our privacy in that regard." More concerning had been the letter from her father that arrived the day after Dr. Morrison's second visit. It was the first communication she had received from him since leaving Cold Mercy, and its contents were as cold and judgmental as she had expected. "Lila," she read aloud to Cade that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I have been informed of your recent marriage and find myself deeply disturbed by the haste and circumstances of this union. While I cannot prevent what has already been done, I feel compelled to warn you that Mr. Whitmore has not abandoned his claims regarding the child you carry. He has consulted with legal authorities and may seek to challenge your marriage on grounds of fraud and deception." Cade's jaw tightened as she continued reading. "Furthermore, questions have been raised about the propriety of your living arrangements prior to the wedding ceremony. Several members of my congregation have expressed concern that your marriage may have been contracted solely to avoid the legal consequences of immoral behavior." "The man has quite an imagination," Cade said grimly. "There's more." Lila's voice had grown steadier with anger. "I feel it is my Christian duty to inform you that I cannot in good conscience acknowledge this marriage or any children that may result from it. You have made your choice, and you must live with the consequences. Do not expect support or recognition from your family in this matter." She folded the letter carefully, her hands remarkably steady, despite the emotional impact of her father's rejection. "He's disowning me, officially and completely. Are you surprised?" Lila considered the question seriously before answering. "No. Disappointed, but not surprised. My father was always more concerned with appearances than with people, even when I was a child. I suppose I hoped that becoming a grandmother might soften him, but that was naive." "His loss," Cade said simply, reaching for her hand. "Any man who would disown his own daughter for choosing love over shame isn't much of a father to begin with." The words were comforting, but they couldn't entirely ease the sadness that came with having her fears confirmed. She was truly alone in the world now, except for the man beside her and the child growing within her. It was both terrifying and liberating, the knowledge that she had no safety net except what she and Cade built together. As if sensing her thoughts, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly. "Active tonight," Cade observed, his eyes crinkling with the gentle humor she had come to love. "Very active. I think this child is going to be a handful. Takes after its mother, then." The teasing comment was delivered with such obvious affection that Lila felt her melancholy lifting despite the weight of her father's rejection. This was her family now, this quiet, strong man who had shown her what real love looked like, and the child who would complete their small circle. But even as she treasured these peaceful moments, Lila could not shake the feeling that they were living in a brief calm before a storm. Thomas's threats, her father's warnings, the pointed questions from Dr. Morrison, all of these suggested that their carefully constructed new life was still vulnerable to outside interference. The feeling proved prophetic when a rider arrived the next morning with news that made Cade's face go pale with concern. Thomas Whitmore had returned to Cold Mercy, this time accompanied by a territorial judge and a marshal carrying legal documents that challenged the validity of their marriage. "He's claiming fraud," the messenger explained, a young man who clearly relished being the bearer of dramatic news. "Says you coerced Miss Mercer, Mrs. Rawlins, into marrying you to avoid facing charges for harboring a woman in immoral circumstances. Says the whole thing was a sham to cover up improper relations." "That's ridiculous," Lila said, her voice sharp with indignation. "Maybe so, Mum, but Judge Carmichael takes these things serious. He's ordered you both to appear in Cold Mercy tomorrow for a formal hearing. Says if you don't show, he'll issue a warrant for your arrest." As the messenger rode away, leaving them to absorb this new crisis, Lila felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. Just when she had found safety and happiness, just when she had begun to believe that the worst was behind them, the past had reached out to drag her back into uncertainty. "What do we do?" she asked, hating the note of fear that had crept into her voice. Cade was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the mountains that ringed their valley like protective walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet determination she had heard the day he first brought her to the ranch. "We go to cold mercy," he said simply. "We tell the truth, and we fight for what's ours." The words were brave, but as Lila looked toward the town that had been so eager to cast her out, she wondered if the truth would be enough to protect the life they had built together. Tomorrow would bring the final test of whether love could truly triumph over the forces of shame and judgment that had ruled her life for so long. The courthouse in Cold Mercy had never seemed so imposing as it did on that sweltering August morning when Lila and Cade arrived to defend their marriage. The building, which normally served as a meeting hall for town functions, had been transformed into a formal court with Judge Carmichael's bench positioned beneath the large window that faced Main Street. Half the town seemed to have gathered for the proceedings, filling every available seat and lining the walls with the eager anticipation of spectators at a prize fight. Lila walked slowly up the courthouse steps, her hand resting on Cade's steady arm for support. At 8 months pregnant, every movement required careful consideration, but she held her head high as she passed through the crowd of familiar faces. Some watched with open hostility, others with curiosity, but a few like Mrs. Patterson and the Hendricks family offered encouraging nods that reminded her she was not entirely without allies. Thomas Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table with Attorney Brennan, his expression radiating the confidence of a man certain of victory. He had dressed for the occasion in his finest suit, every inch the successful businessman seeking justice against rural fraudsters. When Lila entered the room, his eyes fixed on her swollen figure with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Judge Carmichael was a stern-faced man in his 50s, appointed by the territorial government and known for his strict interpretation of the law. He called the proceedings to order with the sharp rap of his gavel, and the murmur of conversation died immediately. "This court is convened to hear the matter of Whitmore versus Rawlins," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Mr. Whitmore seeks to have the marriage between Mr. Cade Rawlins and the former Miss Lila Mercer declared invalid on grounds of fraud and coercion." Attorney Brennan rose smoothly to present his case, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, was engaged in legitimate business in Denver when he learned that the woman carrying his child had been essentially sold to Mr. Rawlins by her father. Rather than wait for Mr. Whitmore's return to properly address the situation, Mr. Rawlins took advantage of Miss Mercer's vulnerable condition to enter into a fraudulent marriage designed solely to prevent Mr. Whitmore from claiming his parental rights. The words painted Lila as a helpless victim and Cade as a scheming opportunist, reducing their love to a mere legal maneuver. She felt Cade's hand tighten on hers, but his expression remained calm as Brennan continued his attack. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Rawlins and Miss Mercer were living in immoral circumstances for months prior to their hasty wedding ceremony. Dr. Morrison will testify that he observed clear signs of intimate relations between the defendants, making their marriage nothing more than an attempt to legitimize sinful behavior." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this accusation, and Lila felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The lies came so easily to these men, wrapped in legal language that made slander sound like justice. "Mr. Whitmore seeks custody of his unborn child and compensation for the emotional distress caused by the defendant's deceptive actions," Brennan concluded. "We ask this court to declare the marriage void and restore my client's rightful position as father to the child in question." Judge Carmichael nodded gravely and turned to the defense table where Cade and Lila sat with the young lawyer they had managed to engage from a neighboring town. Samuel Crawford was barely out of law school, but he had the passionate idealism of youth and a genuine belief in justice that more experienced attorneys might have lost. "Mr. Crawford, you may present your defense." Crawford stood, his nervous energy evident as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, This case represents nothing more than the desperate attempt of a man who abandoned his responsibilities to reclaim what he discarded when it became inconvenient. Whitmore left Miss Mercer to face shame and hardship alone. Mr. Rawlins offered her protection, respect, and eventually his name in marriage union entered into freely and with genuine affection. The young lawyer's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his argument. The marriage certificate is valid, properly executed by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls. Mrs. Rawlins will testify that she entered the union willingly, motivated by love rather than legal convenience. This court should not reward abandonment by punishing the good man who stepped forward when Mr. Whitmore failed in his duties. As Crawford spoke, Lila noticed movement near the back of the courtroom. Her father had entered quietly, his presence commanding immediate attention from those who recognized him. Reverend Isaiah Mercer walked slowly down the center aisle, his face grave as he took a seat in the front row. The sight of him sent a chill through her had he come to support Thomas's claims. To publicly disown her before the entire community? Judge Carmichael called for the first witness, and Dr. Morrison took the stand with obvious reluctance. Under Brennan's questioning, he testified about his visits to the ranch, carefully implying impropriety without making direct accusations that could be easily challenged. "In your professional opinion, Dr. Morrison," Brennan asked, "did Mrs. Rawlins appear to be a woman who had entered marriage freely, or one who might have been coerced by circumstances?" Before Dr. Morrison could answer, the courthouse bell began to toll-knot the regular hourly chime, but the urgent rhythm used to call the community together in times of crisis. The sound seemed to echo through the building like a divine judgment, demanding attention and bearing witness to the truth about to be revealed. Dr. Morrison's testimony faltered as the bell continued its urgent tolling, and Judge Carmichael frowned at the interruption. But before he could call for order, Lila felt a familiar tightening in her belly, different from the usual discomfort, sharper and more insistent. She gripped Cade's hand, her face going pale as understanding dawned. "The baby," she whispered, and the words seemed to carry through the suddenly quiet courtroom. Cade's chair scraped against the wooden floor as he stood immediately, his protective instincts overriding all legal protocols. "Your Honor, my wife needs medical attention." "Now see here," Thomas protested, rising from his seat with obvious irritation. "This is clearly a ploy to avoid." His words were cut short as Lila doubled over with a sharp cry, her hand pressed to her belly as another contraction seized her. The reality of the situation became immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom, and the legal proceedings suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the drama of impending birth. Dr. Morrison abandoned the witness stand without being dismissed, his professional instincts taking precedence over legal formalities. "We need to get her somewhere she can lie down," he said, moving quickly to Lila's side. "This baby's not waiting for your hearing to conclude." "She can't leave," Attorney Brennan insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "The court must resolve this matter before." "The court," Judge Carmichael interrupted with surprising firmness, "will not interfere with the birth of a child. This hearing is suspended until further notice." As Cade swept Lila into his arms with gentle strength, preparing to carry her from the courthouse, an unexpected voice rose from the front row. "Wait." Reverend Isaiah Mercer stood slowly, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. "Before you go, there are things that must be said, things this court needs to hear." Thomas turned eagerly toward the preacher, clearly expecting support for his cause. "Reverend Mercer, thank you for coming. I'm sure you'll help this court understand the true nature of—" "Be silent," Isaiah commanded with the authority that had silenced congregations for decades. "You forfeited any right to speak about my daughter when you abandoned her in her hour of need." The courthouse fell into absolute stillness, everyone straining to hear what the preacher would say next. Another contraction gripped Lila, but she managed to remain conscious as her father approached the bench. "Your Honor," Isaiah said, his voice carrying across the room with practiced projection, "I have come here today not to support Mr. Whitmore's claims, but to confess my own sins before this community and before God. He turned to face the packed courtroom, his eyes finding Lila's for the first time in months. I stand before you as a man who preached love while showing none to his own child, who spoke of forgiveness while harboring judgment in his heart, who valued his reputation more than his daughter's welfare. Thomas started to protest, but Isaiah's raised hand silenced him immediately. When my daughter needed me most, I cast her out like refuse, the preacher continued, his voice breaking with emotion. I gave her to Mr. Rawlins not out of concern for her welfare, but to preserve my own standing in this community. I failed as a father and as a Christian. He moved closer to where Cade held Lila, his weathered hands trembling as he reached toward them both. But Cade Rawlins succeeded where I failed. He saw my daughter's worth when I could see only my own shame. He offered her safety when I offered only judgment. He gave her love when I gave her nothing but cold duty. Another contraction seized Lila, more intense than the last, and Cade shifted her carefully in his arms. Reverend, we need to— One moment more, Isaiah said urgently. Mr. Whitmore, you speak of rights and claims, but what claim does a man have who flees when faced with responsibility? What right to fatherhood belongs to someone who leaves a woman to bear shame alone? He turned back to the judge, his voice gaining strength. Your Honor, I have witnessed the marriage between my daughter and Cade Rawlins these past weeks. I have seen how he cares for her, how she has flourished under his protection. This is no fraud or deception, this is love, pure and simple. The kind of love I should have shown my daughter, but was too proud to give. The simple gold wedding band on Lila's finger caught the light streaming through the courthouse windows as another contraction racked her body. She looked at her father through tears of pain and unexpected hope, seeing for the first time in months the man who had raised her rather than the cold stranger who had cast her out. I ask this court, Isaiah concluded, his voice now thick with emotion, to recognize what I was too blind to see, that my daughter has found not just a husband, but a true partner. That the child she carries will be raised by parents who chose each other freely and love each other deeply. Judge Carmichael looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the community members who had witnessed this unexpected testimony. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of both legal authority and human compassion. In light of the testimony presented and the immediate circumstances, he announced, this court finds no evidence of fraud or coercion in the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Rawlins. The union is declared valid in all respects, and Mr. Whitmore's petition is denied. Thomas shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. This is outrageous. You can't— Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice cutting through Thomas's protests, this court warns Mr. Whitmore that any further harassment of the Rawlins family will result in legal consequences. Your parental claims, such as they were, ended when you abandoned your responsibilities. As if in celebration of the verdict, Lila's body announced that the baby would wait no longer. Her cry of pain mixed with relief echoed through the courthouse, and Cade didn't wait for further permission before carrying her toward the door. Dr. Morrison, he called over his shoulder, we'll need your help. Right behind you, the doctor replied, gathering his medical bag with practiced efficiency. As they left the courthouse, Lila caught one last glimpse of Thomas's defeated face and her father's expression of profound regret mixed with hope for redemption. The legal battle was over, but the most important part of her journey was just beginning, the moment when she would finally hold her child in her arms, free from shame and surrounded by love. 6 hours later, as the first stars appeared in the mountain sky, Elizabeth Sarah Rawlins took her first breath in the bedroom, where her mother had found refuge and love. She was perfect in every way that matter-written tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a voice that announced her arrival with indignant vigor. Dr. Morrison, who had delivered half the babies in cold mercy, declared her the healthiest infant he had seen in months. Cade held his daughter with the reverent care of a man who understood he was holding a miracle. His large, work-roughened hands looked impossibly gentle, cradling the tiny bundle, and when Elizabeth wrapped her miniature fingers around his thumb, Lila saw tears glisten in his dark eyes. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Perfect." "She looks like you," Lila said, though she knew it was probably too early to make such determinations. What she really meant was that Elizabeth already showed signs of the quiet strength that defined the man who would raise her as his own daughter. The handmade cradle that had waited so patiently in the corner of their room finally served its purpose, lined with soft blankets that Mrs. Patterson had brought during the long afternoon of labor. Elizabeth settled into it, as if she had always belonged there, which, Lila reflected, she had. The days that followed blurred together in the sweet exhaustion that comes with new parenthood. Cade proved to be a devoted father, rising for nighttime feedings without complaint and learning to change diapers with the same careful attention he brought to every task. He would stand by the cradle for long minutes just watching Elizabeth sleep, and Lila often caught him talking to her in low, gentle tones about the ranch, the animals, and the life she would grow up knowing. "She'll need to learn to ride before she can properly walk," he told Elizabeth one morning as he changed her diaper with practiced efficiency. "Can't live on a ranch without knowing horses. And we'll teach her about the garden too, how to make things grow, how to be patient with the seasons." Lila watched these interactions with a contentment so complete it sometimes took her breath away. This was what family looked like, not the cold duty she had known in her father's house, but the warm partnership she and Cade had built together. Elizabeth would grow up understanding that love was shown through daily kindnesses, through steadfast presence, through choosing to stay when staying was difficult. 3 weeks after Elizabeth's birth, her grandfather came calling. Reverend Isaiah Mercer arrived on a Sunday afternoon, his hands twisting his hat brim as he stood awkwardly on the front porch. He looked older than Lila remembered, as if the weight of his regrets had aged him more than mere time. "I was wondering," he said carefully, "if I might meet my granddaughter." Lila and Cade exchanged glances, both remembering the cold stranger who had given her away like unwanted property. But they also remembered the broken man who had stood before the courthouse and confessed his failures to the entire community. "She's sleeping," Lila said, stepping aside to let him enter. "But you're welcome to see her." Isaiah followed them to the bedroom where Elizabeth lay in her cradle, one tiny fist pressed to her cheek in the complete abandon of infant slumber. For several minutes, he simply stood there, his eyes drinking in every detail of the granddaughter he had almost lost through his own pride. "She's perfect," he whispered finally, echoing Cade's words from that first night. "Absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold her?" Lila offered, and the hope that flickered in her father's eyes reminded her of the man who had once read her bedtime stories and taught her to fish in the creek behind the parsonage. Isaiah held Elizabeth with the careful reverence of a man who understood he was being given an undeserved gift. When she stirred and opened her eyes, fixing him with that unfocused but intense gaze that newborns possessed, his composure finally cracked. "I'm sorry," he said, the words directed at Elizabeth but meant for them all. "I'm so sorry for everything, for failing your mother when she needed me most, for valuing my pride over my daughter's welfare, for almost missing the chance to know you." "We all make mistakes, Reverend," Cade said quietly. "What matters is what we do next." What Isaiah did next was surprising in its humility. He began visiting regularly, not as the righteous preacher dispensing judgment, but as a grandfather eager to be part of his granddaughter's life. He helped with the garden harvest, shared stories of Lila's mother that brought tears and laughter in equal measure, and gradually rebuilt the relationship with his daughter that his pride had nearly destroyed. Thomas Whitmore, meanwhile, had left Cold Mercy immediately after the court hearing and had not been heard from since. Attorney Brennan had returned to Denver, presumably to find clients with more promising cases. The town itself seemed to have collectively decided that the Rawlins family deserved the same respect accorded to any other established ranch family in the valley. On a crisp October morning, when Elizabeth was 2 months old and the aspen trees had turned the mountainsides to gold, Lila stood in her wildflower garden, holding her daughter. The flowers had grown beyond her wildest expectations, creating a natural meadow that attracted butterflies and birds in delightful abundance. Elizabeth seemed fascinated by the dancing butterflies, her eyes tracking their movement with the intense concentration only babies could achieve. "Look there, little one," Lila whispered, pointing to a monarch butterfly that had landed on a nearby stem. "Beautiful things can grow from the smallest beginnings." Cade emerged from the barn where he had been tending to a horse with a minor injury, and the sight of his two girls, surrounded by flowers, made him stop in his tracks. This was the family he had never dared hope, for the love that had grown from what others saw as punishment into something more precious than gold. "What are you thinking about?" Lila asked as he joined them in the garden. "Just counting my blessings," he replied, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Thinking about how sometimes the best things come when you least expect them." Elizabeth chose that moment to take her first tentative steps, wobbling between her parents with the determined concentration of someone tackling a great adventure. As she collapsed into Cade's waiting arms with a delighted giggle, Lila realized that this was what redemption looked like, not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of countless small choices to love, to stay, to build something beautiful together. The woman who had once been handed over as punishment had become the queen of her own small kingdom, ruling not through power, but through the quiet sovereignty of a life built on love, respect, and the knowledge that some gifts come disguised as burdens until we learn to see them clearly.